Do you believe money can buy absolutely everything? Wait until you hear what happened on this flight. Imagine a man with a fortune of $8 billion, used to commanding the world, being brought to his knees, publicly humiliated at 35,000 feet, not by a business rival, but by the uncontrollable crying of his own baby. For 3 hours, first class turned into hell. The elite looked on with disgust. The pilot made humiliating indirect remarks, and Renato, the untouchable billionaire, was on the verge of breaking down in tears, completely powerless. But when everyone had already turned their backs, the unthinkable happened. Salvation did not come from luxury or from the crew. It came from the back of the plane. Leah, a poor black teenage girl from economy class, did what no one else had the courage to do. She crossed the curtain of prejudice, ignored the hateful stares, and with a single move that defied everyone's logic, she silenced the entire plane in 10 seconds. The silence was absolute. But what she did with that child shocked the passengers. And the secret the billionaire later discovered inside her old, worn-out backpack will make you question everything you think you know about who truly has value in this world. Prepare your heart, because what was found in that notebook changed their destiny forever. If you want to know what this miracle was and the shocking revelation that followed, subscribe to the channel now, turn on the notification bell, and stay with me until the end of this video. You won't want to miss a single detail of this emotional story. Imagine a man who has the world in the palm of his hand, the kind of person used to giving an order and seeing everything happen in the snap of a finger. That was Renato Garcia, a powerful CEO who moved billions and who absolutely never heard no as an answer. He boarded that plane with the posture of a king, wearing a suit that cost more than many people's cars, radiating the unshakable confidence of someone who controls destiny. For him, that first-class trip would be just another moment of peace, steeped in luxury, expensive comfort, and absolute ease, while his little son, Kevin, slept quietly by his side like an innocent little angel. But life has a funny, sometimes cruel way of showing who is really in charge, and that day the command was not in the billionaire's hands. The luxurious first-class cabin, with its soft leather seats and gentle lighting, seemed like the perfect stage for success, but it would soon turn into an arena of judgment. Renato settled the baby, believing that his aura of power would be enough to keep the child calm. After all, he dealt with sharks from the financial market every single day. What could possibly go wrong with a baby in his arms? He had no idea he was facing the most difficult and loudest negotiator of his entire career. It happened suddenly, without warning, when the silence of the cabin was broken by a low whimper, the kind every parent knows and that sends a chill down the spine. Renato tried to ignore it. He adjusted his seatbelt, glanced to the side, and attempted to maintain the posture of, everything is under control. But the whimper turned into crying, and the crying became a piercing scream that seemed to drill into the ears of anyone within miles. The baby didn't care if his father owned an empire. In that moment, Kevin was just a child in distress, and no overflowing bank account could buy the silence or calm Renato so desperately needed. Can you picture the scene? The man who decided the future of massive corporations was now there, breaking into a cold sweat, trying everything to outsmart his own son. He rocked the baby, offered a pacifier, waved expensive toys in front of him, but nothing worked. The crying only grew louder, reaching a deafening volume that clashed violently with the quiet elegance of that exclusive environment. It was as if the universe itself was saying, "Here, your money is worth nothing." With every passing second, Renato's armor of untouchability began to crack, revealing an ordinary man, desperate and completely lost. The most painful part wasn't just the noise, but what that noise represented in that space. In first class, silence is the most valuable commodity, and Renato was stealing it from everyone around him. He felt the stares burning into his back, not looks of admiration like he was used to, but of annoyance and disapproval. He tried to smile, to apologize with gestures, but his hands trembled slightly. Public humiliation was starting to settle in, not because he was weak, but because, for once, he was facing a problem he could not outsource or solve by signing a check. Kevin's crying seemed to have endless energy, an alarm siren that never shut off. Renato, who always had ready answers and quick solutions for corporate crises, found himself with no cards left to play. He looked at his son and saw an indecipherable puzzle. The baby's face was red, tears streamed down, and the CEO felt the weight of every judging look from the other passengers as if stones were being thrown at him. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, tightening his chest more than the Italian silk tie he had already loosened in a desperate attempt to breathe. Think about the irony of the situation. He was surrounded by luxury, with flight attendants ready to serve caviar, but all he wanted was to disappear or find a magical mute button. The plane was still on the ground or climbing, and the pressure in little Kevin's ears might have been the cause, but Renato didn't know that. He only knew he was failing. And failing in public for a man like him was worse than death. He tried to rock the boy to sleep, but his movements were stiff and tense, passing all his nervousness onto the child, which only made the cycle of chaos worse. The social mask of the successful man was melting under the cabin lights. He who had always been the predator at the top of the food chain, now felt like the prey trapped in a velvet seat. People around him began to whisper, roll their eyes, and every impatient sigh from a neighboring passenger sounded like thunder in Renato's head. With a bitter taste in his mouth, he realized that in there he wasn't the respected CEO. He was just the guy with the noisy baby ruining everyone's elite travel experience. And the worst part was that he knew he couldn't simply leave. They were trapped inside a sealed metal tube. There was no exit door, no conference room to hide in, no escape to fix the problem. It was him and the crying face to face. The humiliation was being broadcast live to the most demanding audience possible. Renato looked at his wristwatch, an exclusive model, and watched as minutes felt like hours. Time dragged on, and desperation began to take over his logical thoughts. At that moment, as the plane leveled off in the air, Renato felt a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with turbulence. He looked out the window, saw the clouds outside, and when he looked back down the aisle, he realized the nightmare was far from over. Kevin's crying showed no signs of stopping, and the flight would be long. He took a deep breath, trying to find a calm that didn't exist, unaware that those first minutes of panic were only the prelude to something far more intense still to come. If you think a few minutes of crying are annoying, try to imagine what 3 uninterrupted hours of a piercing wail mean inside a pressurized cabin at 35,000 feet. Time, which usually flies by when you are comfortably seated in first class sipping a vintage wine, now seemed frozen in a loop of psychological torture. Renato looked at the flight map in front of him, watching the tiny virtual airplane advance only millimeters, and felt an anguish he had never experienced in any financial crisis. Every passing minute scraped away a little more of his sanity, turning that modern environment into a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. It was not just the noise, it was its relentless consistency, a sound that offered no relief, allowed no clear thoughts, and turned the icy air conditioning into a suffocating heat of pure nervousness and anxiety. The situation reached a critical point when the pilot's voice, usually calm and reassuring, came over the speakers with a tone carrying a razor-sharp hint. "Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask for everyone's cooperation in maintaining calm in the cabin, as we have a long flight ahead." That was not a general announcement, it was a direct message addressed with a name and seat number to 1A. Renato felt his face burn with shame, a red flush climbing up his neck that even the collar of his dress shirt could not hide. He knew the pilot was politely asking him to fix the situation, as if there were an off switch on a child. That public announcement was the official stamp of his incompetence in that moment, echoing throughout the aircraft and validating the unspoken complaint of every passenger on board. Renato's attempts to soothe Kevin had long since moved past logic and into absolute, chaotic desperation. He had stood up, walked the narrow aisle, done squats while rocking the baby, sung lullabies he did not even remember knowing, and had even offered his gold watch as if the shine might hypnotize the child. Nothing worked. The baby writhed in his arms, arching his back into a tense curve, screaming with a lung power that seemed impossible for such a small being. The CEO was exhausted, his arms aching from the weight and the muscle tension of holding his son through the struggle, and his mind, once accustomed to processing complex data, was now reduced to a single repetitive thought: "Please stop, please stop." The looks around him were no longer merely annoyed and had turned into true beams of pure, distilled hatred. There was a woman in the seat beside him, covered in jewelry and wearing a silk sleep mask, who sighed loudly every 5 seconds, making sure to display her displeasure. An executive across the aisle tapped his fingers aggressively on the armrest, staring at Renato as if he wanted to throw him off the plane mid-flight. The atmosphere was hostile, dense, charged with a negative energy that seemed to weigh tons on Renato's shoulders. He felt like an intruder, an unwanted virus in that ecosystem of elite comfort and silence bought at a premium price. Control of the situation had completely slipped through his fingers like fine sand. Renato, the man who managed corporate mergers and mass layoffs without blinking, was now a hostage to a baby in his arms. He asked one of the flight attendants for help, but even they, trained to smile through any catastrophe, showed visible exhaustion. They brought water, brought warm towels, offered polite, strained smiles, but deep in their eyes Renato saw the same silent plea he saw in the other passengers: "Make it stop." The sense of isolation was brutal. He was surrounded by people, yet he had never felt so alone and helpless in his entire life. The first-class cabin, designed to be a sanctuary of peace, had turned into an echo chamber for Kevin's suffering and Renato's failure. The crying reverberated off the walls, pierced through noise-canceling headphones passengers clung to desperately, and seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the plane. Renato felt he was losing the battle, not just against the crying, but against his own image as a capable, decisive man. He looked at his son and saw a stranger, a small being he loved, but who in that moment seemed determined to destroy his confidence and peace of mind. The bond between father and son was being tested under extreme pressure. At one point, Renato slumped back again in defeat, resting his head against the seat and closing his eyes for a single second, only to snap them open immediately at the sound of another shrill scream. He noticed his shirt was soaked with sweat down his back, his once perfect hair was disheveled, and his tie had been tossed somewhere onto the neighboring seat. The image of success had been dismantled piece by piece. He looked at his hands and saw they were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a toxic adrenaline with nowhere to go. He was trapped in a metal box thousands of feet above the ground, with no escape, no refuge and no plan B. The feeling of claustrophobia hit hard, mixed with shame. He imagined what people in economy class might be saying about him, or what the pilots might be commenting on in the cockpit. The paranoia of being the center of negative attention eroded his confidence. Every time someone stood up to go to the restroom and passed by him, Renato instinctively hunched his shoulders, bracing for a verbal complaint or an even sharper look of contempt. He had become small in the face of that massive situation. His money, his black cards, his influential contacts meant nothing there. He was just a father failing miserably in front of his own child. Time continued to crawl, each second lasting a painful eternity. The baby, red-faced and sweaty, also seemed to be at the limit of his strength, yet the crying did not stop, fueled by a discomfort Renato could not decipher. Hunger? A dirty diaper? Sleep? He had tried to solve all of it and the answer was still the scream. Helplessness left a bitter taste in his mouth, a knot in his throat that made it hard even to swallow the water the flight attendant had left half an hour earlier. Renato was adrift, navigating a sea of emotional chaos without a compass. But while chaos ruled the front of the plane and the elite squirmed in their comfortable seats, something was about to change the dynamic of that flight. Renato, blinded by his own desperation and focused only on the judging looks around him, did not see that the true verdict of that airborne courtroom would not come only from the rich and powerful seated beside him. The atmosphere was far too charged, far too heavy, and when an elite decides it has had enough, cruelty can take on far more direct and verbal forms than simple sideways glances. The mask of civility in first class began to fall quickly, revealing the ugly and relentless face of elitism when it is challenged. Those passengers, accustomed to having the world shaped to their will, did not see Kevin's crying as the suffering of a defenseless human being, but as an unacceptable failure in a service for which they had paid thousands of dollars. To them, silence was not merely the absence of noise, it was an acquired right, a luxury commodity that was being stolen. Compassion was instantly replaced by a cold, calculated indignation, where empathy had no seat in the reclining chairs of Italian leather. They no longer looked at Renato as an equal, a respectable businessman, but as an incompetent intruder who dared to bring chaos into their sanctuaries, breaking the sacred code of silent exclusivity. The murmurs began to grow audible, loose phrases thrown into the air with enough venom to crush anyone's morale. "This is absurd, allowing this in here," hissed a man in a pinstripe suit, not even bothering to lower his voice as he swirled his glass of whiskey with disdain. Another passenger, a socialite who looked like she had stepped straight out of a magazine cover, covered her ears theatrically and snapped her fingers aggressively to summon a flight attendant, demanding an immediate solution to that torture, as if the child were a faulty sound system that could simply be turned off or thrown away. The atmosphere of sophistication evaporated, giving way to a toxic environment of complaints and judgment, where money dictated that other people's discomfort should be invisible and inaudible. The judgment was collective and brutal, a sentence delivered by 12 wealthy jurors who had already condemned Renato and his son to social ostracism. They rolled their eyes in unison with every new scream from Kevin, creating an invisible but impenetrable barrier around seat 1A. No one offered help, no one asked if the child was in pain, no one reached out a hand. On the contrary, they physically pulled away as much as their seat belts allowed, turning their bodies toward the windows or the aisle in a choreography of explicit exclusion. It was the social divide manifesting in its rawest form. Your problem is not my problem, and the fact that you have a problem offends me. The dehumanization of the situation was palpable. To that elite, the baby was not a person. He was an inconvenience, a disturbance in the flawless display of their privileged lives. They treated the situation with the same impatience they would show a waiter who spilled wine on a tablecloth. The lack of solidarity was shocking, exposing how deeply status can erode the basic humanity of caring about others. Renato, surrounded by people who could buy islands, discovered he was in the company of the poorest souls he had ever known. Their material wealth only served to amplify their emotional poverty, creating a vacuum where understanding should have existed. The pressure on the crew became unbearable, with passengers threatening to file formal complaints with the airline and demanding absurd compensation for the disturbance. The flight attendants, caught in the crossfire, tried to calm tempers with more drinks and whispered apologies, but the elite did not want apologies, they wanted silence. They looked at Renato with an arrogance that clearly said, "You do not belong here if you cannot control your offspring." The contempt was so dense it seemed to thicken the oxygen around Renato, leaving him suffocating under the weight of his peers' disapproval. There was a moment when a young executive, focused on his laptop, slammed it shut and snapped, "Can someone shut that kid up, or are we going to have to land this plane?" The words echoed like a slap across Renato's face, a direct verbal assault that made his blood run cold. That man was not concerned about the baby, he was concerned about his spreadsheet, his productivity, his own ego. Selfishness reigned supreme, turning the cabin into a stage of wounded vanities, where a child's crying was seen as a personal attack on the peace of those untouchable demigods. Renato felt firsthand the isolation that comes when you stop being useful or pleasant to high society. While everything was fine, he was the admired CEO. Now, with a problem in his arms, he was a pariah. The elite closed in on themselves to protect against the ugly and the chaotic, and in that moment Renato and Kevin embodied chaos. They shielded themselves with their state-of-the-art noise-canceling headphones, trying to erase the existence of father and son, turning them into unwanted ghosts haunting a perfect journey. The cruelty of that distancing was more painful than any spoken word. Watching people turn their backs, deliberately ignoring a father's desperation, was a bitter lesson in the nature of relationships at that social level. There was no sense of community there, no, "we're in this together." There were only individuals fighting for their own comfort at any cost. Their judgment was final. Renato had failed, and the response was absolute contempt. They raised a wall of coldness so high that not even Kevin's loudest scream could cross it to touch hearts armored by privilege. The contrast was brutal, crystal glasses clinking softly while a baby screamed in pain or fear. The elite continued to eat their gourmet meals, wiping the corners of their mouths with linen napkins, acting as if the agony beside them did not exist, or worse, as if its existence were an offense. That complete disconnection from basic human reality, that ability to switch off empathy like flipping a switch, left Renato stunned. He was seeing his world, the world he was so proud of, through a new and terrifying lens. As the first-class passengers isolated themselves in their bubbles of arrogance, condemning Renato to exile in his own seat, the billionaire's inner structure began to collapse. He endured the stares, endured the veiled remarks, endured the open hostility, but the accumulated weight of it all was about to demand a price far too high. The man of steel was melting, and what would remain when the armor finally fell was something even he was not prepared to face. Renato Garcia had always believed that power was measured by the ability to control chaos, to impose order where there was disorder. But there, in that seat, he discovered in the worst possible way that true power means nothing if you cannot comfort your own blood. His mind, usually sharp as a blade and capable of processing billion-dollar mergers in seconds, slipped into a paralyzing state of shock, a kind of emotional short-circuit that shut down all his cold, calculating logic. He looked at his own hands, the same hands that had signed contracts that changed entire economies, and now saw them trembling, weak, incapable of performing the most primitive and essential task of humanity, caring for a child. The realization hit him like a heavy lead star. He was a giant in the business world, but absolutely powerless inside that aircraft, a king undone by a baby only a few months old. The collapse was not loud like Kevin's crying. It was a silent, devastating implosion happening deep within Renato's soul as he struggled to maintain an outward appearance. He felt his heart beating out of rhythm, an arrhythmia triggered by the panic of having no tools, no resources, no escape. All his arrogance, built brick by brick over years of uninterrupted victories, crumbled like a house of cards in the wind. With a knot in his throat that caused physical pain, he realized he could buy the entire airline if he wanted, could buy everyone's silence, but he could not buy his son's well-being. Money, his greatest weapon, his impenetrable shield, had suddenly become worthless paper, incapable of solving pain or despair. Guilt began to eat away at him from the inside, a cruel, whispering voice reminding him of every time he had outsourced fatherhood to nannies, expensive schools, and imported toys. He didn't know what to do because he had never truly been there. He was a holiday father, an Instagram photo father, not a trench father, and now life was collecting the bill with crushing interest. He looked at Kevin's contorted face and saw more than a crying baby. He saw the reflection of his own personal failure. He had conquered the world outside but lost the most important territory inside his own home. The feeling of being a fraud was overwhelming, making him question every success, every round of applause, every million accumulated, because none of it could stop the tears of the only person who truly mattered in that moment. Renato felt a sudden childish urge to cry along with his son, to curl up in the seat and admit to the universe that he had no idea what he was doing. The armor of the untouchable CEO had shattered, exposing a frightened, vulnerable, and deeply lonely man. He tried to breathe, but the air felt scarce, as if the cabin pressure had vanished just for him. Cold sweat ran down his temples, soaking the collar of his shirt, and he no longer cared to wipe it away. His dignity, that upright and proud posture, had been swept aside, replaced by the slumped, defeated stance of someone carrying the weight of the world only to discover his legs were not strong enough. He looked out the oval airplane window at the endless blue sky and felt a profound existential vertigo. Down there, on the ground, he was a god. Up here he was nobody. That contradiction tore his identity in half. He tried to remember a breathing technique, some piece of coaching advice, some crisis management strategy, but his mind was blank, a wiped blackboard where only the echo of endless crying remained. Helplessness was a slow poison, paralyzing his muscles, making every rocking motion heavier, more mechanical, more desperate. He was drowning on dry land, surrounded by people who judged him, yet sinking alone into his own ocean of incompetence. Renato's inner silence was deafening, a painful contrast to the external noise. He stopped trying to negotiate with the situation, stopped trying to find a logical solution. He simply surrendered to the agony of the moment, accepting that he had lost control. It was a brutal moment of humility, one that brought him to his knees without him ever leaving his seat. He gently stroked his son's head with a trembling hand, silently asking forgiveness for not being the father Kevin needed, for being only a financial provider and not an emotional protector. That realization hurt more sharply than any financial loss he had ever suffered in his career. Physical exhaustion also began to take its toll. Renato's arms burned, his back stiffened, and a pounding headache pulsed in rhythm with the baby's screams. He closed his eyes for a moment, wishing to disappear, wishing to be anyone else, anywhere else. The image of the powerful man had disintegrated, leaving only an exhausted human being at the limit of his strength. He felt on the verge of breaking completely, of having a nervous collapse right there, in front of all those strangers who despised him. The thin line separating sanity from madness was growing ever thinner, stretched to its limit by the unbearable tension of that endless flight. Amid this whirlwind of self-pity and emotional destruction, Renato did not notice that his defenses were completely down. He was so focused on his own misery, so blinded by shame and guilt, that he stopped paying attention to his surroundings. He retreated into a bubble of suffering, believing himself to be the sole protagonist of that Greek tragedy at 35,000 feet. He failed to realize that he was either invisible in his pain or, worse, visible only under the harsh spotlight of judgment. But he was wrong. While the wealthy elite turned their faces away in disgust and Renato himself plunged into the abyss of his helplessness, there was someone on the plane who was not judging. There was a pair of eyes that did not belong to that world of luxury and arrogance, quietly observing every detail of the scene with a different kind of attention. Renato, in his silent collapse, had no idea that help, or at least understanding, would not come from his equals, from those who wore silk and drank champagne. The solution to that desperate riddle was moving in the shadows, far from the first-class seats, in a place where comfort is scarce but humanity sometimes overflows. Renato lowered his head in defeat, unaware that just a few rows away, an unnoticed observer had already understood what no CEO, pilot, or socialite had managed to grasp, and she was about to make a decision that would change everything. A few rows behind the heavy velvet curtain that separated the gods of first class from the mortals of economy, there existed a completely different world, where legroom was a non-existent luxury and noise was a constant fact of life. There, squeezed into a middle seat, sat Leah, a 17-year-old black teenager who seemed to be trying to melt into the worn-upholstery so as not to bother anyone. She wore a simple hoodie, frayed at the sleeves, and held an old backpack in her lap as if it were a protective shield against the world. To the passengers around her and the hurried crew, Leah was just another number, an invisible figure in the crowd, someone who did not deserve a second glance or a courtesy smile. She was used to being ignored, to being part of the background scenery in the lives of important people, but on that flight, while everyone tried to block out the sound coming from the front, Leah did the opposite. She listened with surgical attention. While the elite up front huffed and rolled their eyes, treating the baby's crying as a personal offense, Leah remained alert, her brown eyes fixed on the gap in the curtain that swayed with the turbulence. She did not have expensive noise-canceling headphones, nor did she want them. Her curiosity and instinct spoke louder than discomfort. She watched the frantic movement of the flight attendants, saw the tense shoulders of the man in the suit pacing back and forth with the child, and noticed details most people missed. Where others saw only an incompetent rich father, Leah saw a human being on the verge of a nervous breakdown, sending out distress signals no one was willing to receive. Her invisibility gave her a unique advantage, that of being a silent observer in a theater where everyone else was far too busy playing their roles of outrage. Leah grew up in a crowded home, where silence was an urban legend and chaos was the daily routine, so that noise did not frighten or irritate her the way it affected first-class passengers. Out of necessity, she developed an almost supernatural ability to read environments. She could tell the difference between a tantrum cry and a pain cry, knew when someone was tired or sick just by the way they breathed. There, seated in economy, she began assembling a mental puzzle, analyzing the sounds drifting from the VIP area as if they were data from a complex problem. She did not see status or designer clothes. She saw behaviors, biological reactions, and raw emotional patterns, stripped of any social pretense. The girl noticed that the crew was focused on papering over the cracks, offering drinks and warm towels, but no one was truly looking at the child. It was as if the baby were a ticking time bomb no one wanted to touch, only muffle the ticking sound. Leah felt a tightness in her chest, an empathy that transcended the social barriers imposed inside that metal tube. She knew what it was like to be misunderstood, to try to communicate pain and be met with indifference or hostility. The baby's loneliness, surrounded by luxury but deprived of real comfort, resonated with Leah's own life story, creating an invisible and instant connection between the girl from the outskirts and the billionaire heirs. With every new piercing scream that tore through the air, Leah tilted her head slightly, processing the frequency and intensity of the sound. It was not an ordinary cry, continuous and monotonous. It was explosive, sharp, charged with physical urgency. Through the small opening in the curtain, she could see the baby's legs stretching out and pulling back violently, a movement that to the father seemed merely frantic, but to Leah was a glaring clue. While passengers in economy also began to complain, whispering curses about the entitled rich guy, up front, Leah remained still, isolated in her own bubble of analysis, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the strap of her backpack as her brain raced at full speed. She felt like a stranger in the nest, carrying a refined intellect few people bothered to notice because of her humble appearance and her skin color. Leah was used to being underestimated, to having to prove her worth 10 times more than anyone else, and on that plane it was no different. Who would listen to a girl from economy class? Who would believe that she, who barely had money for the ticket, could have the solution a billionaire CEO did not? That doubt kept her glued to her seat, fear holding her back as it battled the urge to act. She knew that crossing that curtain was more than walking a few steps. It meant crossing a dangerous social abyss where she was not welcome. But Leah's mind could not shut off. She continued cataloging information: flight time, altitude, the baby's age, the father's posture. She noticed the man was holding the child in a way that, though affectionate, was technically wrong for that specific type of discomfort. She saw the sweat on his forehead, the tremor in his hands, and recognized the universal language of panic. While the wealthy judged the man's character, Leah evaluated his technique. The difference between first class and economy: there was not just money but perspective. Some saw a nuisance, she saw a clear diagnosis forming before her attentive eyes. Leah's invisibility was, paradoxically, her superpower in that moment. No one bothered to hide anything from her because no one thought she mattered. She saw flight attendants roll their eyes before entering the main cabin, heard the unfiltered malicious comments. She absorbed it all, filtering out useless noise and focusing only on what mattered: the baby. The crying was changing tone, becoming hoarser, more exhausted, and Leah knew time was running out. The child was entering a stress cycle that would soon become irreversible without proper intervention. She felt a strange sense of responsibility, a calling she could not ignore, born not of obligation but of humanity. There was an instant when Leah's gaze crossed, for a fraction of a second, with that of the desperate father through the gap in the curtain. He did not really see her. He looked through her, blinded by his own suffering. But Leah saw everything. She saw defeat in his eyes, the silent plea for a miracle. That moved her deeply. She knew the world outside said they were natural enemies, opposites in every way, but a father's pain and a child's suffering are languages Leah spoke fluently. The invisible barrier of prejudice and social class seemed insurmountable, but Leah's intelligence and compassion were beginning to erode that wall brick by brick. And then, in a moment of absolute clarity, Leah brought all the loose pieces together. The leg movements, the type of cry, the refusal of the bottle she had glimpsed, the tiny hand clenched into a fist. Everything aligned in her brilliant mind like a perfect mathematical discovery. She knew exactly what was happening to that baby. It was not fussiness, not hunger, not sleep. It was something far more specific, something she knew intimately, and that, surprisingly, had a simple solution, but required a kind of knowledge Renato's money could not buy. Leah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that realization, knowing that keeping that secret would be the safer option, but perhaps not the most just one. For the vast majority of people on that plane, the sound coming from first class was nothing more than chaotic, irritating noise, a jumble of meaningless decibels meant only to disturb the peace. But for Leah, sitting in the back with half-closed eyes and a focused mind, that crying was a code, a complex language she had learned to decipher from a very young age. She did not hear just screams. She heard intervals, noticed shifts in frequency, and picked up on the broken breathing that pointed to something very specific. Her mind, naturally analytical and trained in the school of life of a house full of children, began peeling back the layers of that sound, discarding hunger and simple fussiness and isolating the true cause of the problem. It was as if she were reading sheet music where one note was out of tune, and that note screamed a biological truth that the father's money could not silence. Leah watched, through the gap in the curtain, the small movements of little Kevin's body, and that was the final piece missing from her mental diagnosis. She saw the baby's legs pull violently toward his belly and then stretch out forcefully, in a rhythmic pattern of contraction and release that she knew by heart. That was not a spoiled baby seeking attention. It was visceral pain, sharp and physical. It was severe colic, the kind that makes the intestines feel like they are being twisted from the inside, combined with pressure in the ears the baby did not know how to relieve. While wealthy passengers rolled their eyes at what they called bad behavior, Leah felt a stab of solidarity, recognizing all the classic symptoms of a small body fighting a massive discomfort it could not understand. Beyond the physical pain, Leah identified another invisible enemy attacking the child: sensory overload. First class, with all its focused reading lights, glowing screens, expensive perfumes and the constant hum of the engines, was a direct assault on Kevin's immature nervous system. She saw that the father, in his desperate attempt to entertain his son, was actually making everything worse, rocking him too hard, changing positions every 10 seconds, and bombarding the child with visual and tactile stimuli. Leah knew, by instinct and experience, that the baby needed the opposite: containment, darkness and monotony. The excess of luxury and attention was acting like gasoline on a fire, turning comfort for passengers into a full-blown sensory disorganization crisis for the child. The source of Leah's knowledge did not come from pediatric textbooks or appointments with renowned doctors in marble offices. It came from long sleepless nights caring for her younger siblings and cousins while her mother worked double shifts to put food on the table. It came from the urgent need to solve problems without resources, from having to stop a baby from crying so as not to wake neighbors through thin brick walls. She learned to check temperature with her lips against a forehead, to recognize ear pain by the way a child scratched their head, and to know that colic requires warmth and pressure, not expensive toys. That knowledge was ancestral, passed from woman to woman in her community, practical wisdom worth more than any electronic gadget Renato might try to use. Leah analyzed the situation with a scientist's precision, and her mathematical mind began calculating the variables of the disaster. She saw the vicious cycle forming. Pain caused crying, crying made the baby swallow air, the air increased the belly pain, which in turn intensified the crying and muscle tension. It was an exponential spiral of suffering that would not resolve on its own. She knew that if no one intervened to break that pattern, the baby would enter deep exhaustion and could even develop respiratory complications. The passivity of the other passengers irritated her, because they saw the problem as an external nuisance to be eliminated, while she saw it as a failing biological system that needed a careful, manual reset. The contrast between what Leah knew and what was happening in first class was striking. Renato, A man who likely had degrees from the world's best universities hanging on his wall, looked like a complete amateur in the face of basic human nature. He tried to negotiate with the baby, tried to apply adult logic, tried to buy silence with brand-name pacifiers. Leah, a girl who relied on raffles to afford her education, held the master key to that lock, forged in the harshness of her reality. She understood that the baby's body was craving physical limits, a firm hug that mimicked the womb, not the open, loose space of a first-class seat. The solution was technical, biomechanical, and so clear in her mind that it was frustrating to see no one else notice. As she watched, Leah remembered her grandmother's words, a wise matriarch who had raised 10 children and countless grandchildren. "A child doesn't cry for nothing, my girl. It's either pain or fear or hunger. The rest is talk." That phrase echoed in Leah's mind like a mantra. She ruled out hunger, having seen the full bottle rejected. She ruled out simple fear since the father was there. What remained was pain, the sharp, throbbing pain of trapped gas and atmospheric pressure. She knew exactly where to place her hands, how much pressure to apply to little Kevin's abdomen, and what rhythm to use to calm his nervous system. Her hands, hidden under the sleeves of her hoodie, tingled with the urge to act, to apply the technique that had saved so many nights in her own home. Leah's certainty was absolute, a calm clarity that contrasted with the chaos around her. She was not guessing, it was colic, she knew it. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. The flushed skin, the fists clenched until they turned white, the severe arching of the back. It was an instant visual diagnosis. She thought about how ironic it was that, on a plane full of important and educated people, the only person prepared to solve the emergency was an invisible teenager from economy class. Her knowledge was devalued by the world, seen as something small, domestic, poor people's stuff, but there, 35,000 feet in the air, it was the only knowledge that truly mattered. She felt the weight of responsibility grow inside her. Knowing the answer and being unable to say was a silent torture. She felt the baby's suffering as if it were her own, a physical empathy that made her own stomach tighten. She knew she had the remedy in her hands literally, but she also knew the world ran on rules of position. Who was she to tell a billionaire how to hold his own child? Who was she to intrude into the sacred space of the elite? Cold logic told her to stay quiet, put on headphones and ignore it like everyone else. It would be the safer path, the path of least resistance. But Kevin's crying reached a new peak, a hoarse, desperate sound from someone who could no longer endure fighting their own pain. That sound pierced Leah's hesitation, triggering a protective instinct stronger than any social fear. She knew what was at stake, knew how to stop it, and knew that every second lost meant more suffering for an innocent soul. Yet between knowing the solution and having permission to apply it lay a minefield of racial and social prejudice she would have to cross. And the fear of being misunderstood, of being seen not as a savior but as a threat, began to freeze her blood, momentarily paralyzing her in her seat as a violent moral battle raged inside her mind. Leah felt the electric impulse surge through her legs, ordering her to stand up, but a much heavier, resisting force kept her glued to the seat, the paralyzing fear of social judgment. She looked at the curtain separating the classes and saw not just a piece of navy blue fabric, but a militarized border, an invisible wall built from centuries of prejudice and inequality. In her mind, crossing that line was not simply walking to the front of the plane. It was invading a territory where her presence was not requested and worse, where she knew she would be immediately questioned. A cruel doubt hammered in her head. How would a black girl, wearing a worn hoodie and old sneakers, be received in those sanctuaries of wealth and power? The logical answer was painful and made her stomach churn with anxiety. She would be seen as an intruder, a foreign body that needed to be expelled to preserve the order of the elite. Leah's fear was not unfounded. It was a survival scar she had carried on her skin since a very young age. She knew that, to people like Renato and the other first-class passengers, the image of her approaching would not be interpreted as a gesture of help, but as a threat or an impertinence. The world had already taught her, in subtle and brutal ways, that her existence had to ask permission, while their arrogance had free passage. She imagined the scene in terrifying detail, suspicious looks turning toward her, someone clutching their purse tighter, a flight attendant blocking her way with that fake, condescending smile asking, "Are you lost, sweetheart?" The fear of being publicly humiliated, of being sent back to her place, like a disobedient animal, froze her muscles and suffocated her courage. There was also the crushing weight of imposter syndrome screaming in her ears, telling her she had no authority to intervene. Who was she to teach a billionaire how to care for his own child? Who was she to think she knew more than people who traveled the world and had access to the best doctors? Insecurity mixed with racial fear, creating a toxic cocktail of paralysis. She thought about the visual contrast, her hands, calloused from helping with domestic work, against the flawless skin of Ayer's children. She felt that by standing up she would be challenging a natural order, imposed by society, and the price for such audacity might be too high. Invisibility was her shield, her safe zone. Leaving it would expose her to scrutiny she was not sure she could endure. Leah's breathing grew shallow, and her hands became clammy as she gripped the straps of her backpack. She pictured the first-class passengers as judges in a silent courtroom, ready to condemn any misstep. She feared that if she tried to touch the child she might be accused of something terrible, of trying to harm or kidnap him, because a prejudiced mind creates narratives of danger where only solidarity exists. This fear of being misinterpreted is a constant burden for those who live on the margins, and there, 35,000 feet in the air with nowhere to escape, the pressure was multiplied 1,000-fold. She did not want to be that girl who caused trouble on the flight. She only wanted the baby to stop suffering, but the path between desire and action was mined with stereotypes she had no power to dismantle alone. She looked around at the other economy-class passengers and saw many of them sleeping or watching movies, oblivious to the drama or simply resigned to it. That made her feel even more alone in her intention. Why me, she asked herself. Why do I have to care when no one else does? The temptation to close her eyes, put her headphones on at full volume, and pretend nothing was happening was strong. It would be the easiest path, the one that guaranteed her emotional safety and avoided any discomfort. But the baby's crying kept piercing her soul, a constant reminder that omission is also a choice, and that ignoring someone else's pain when you hold the cure in your hands is a form of cowardice Leah could not accept in herself. The internal struggle was violent. On one side, the instinct of self-preservation, shaped by years of stay in your place and don't draw attention. On the other, the maternal and human instinct that could not tolerate seeing an innocent suffer because of someone else's incompetence. Leah knew that if she went up there and was rejected, the shame would follow her for the rest of her life. She could already hear the hypothetical phrases, "Go back to your seat, we don't need your help, who let this girl through?" Each possibility felt like a blow to her dignity. She trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the adrenaline of being on the verge of doing something that challenged all the unwritten rules of social behavior in spaces segregated by money. On top of that, she thought about the father himself. Renato looked on the brink of collapse, and powerful men in vulnerable situations can be unpredictable and aggressive. Would he accept help from an unknown teenager? Or would he see her approach as yet another confirmation of his failure, reacting with anger to protect his wounded ego? Leah knew she was dealing with a wounded animal backed into a corner, and approaching him required not just technical knowledge about babies, but diplomacy and courage she was not sure she possessed. The risk of being harshly rejected was real and tangible, making her heart pound so hard she felt the passenger beside her might hear it. Time passed and inertia seemed to be winning. Leah sank deeper into her seat, trying to convince herself it was not her problem, that soon the baby would tire and fall asleep. She tried to rationalize her passivity, telling herself there must surely be a doctor on board, or someone more qualified, more appropriate for the situation. But her intelligence would not let her lie to herself. She knew it was not a serious medical issue requiring a doctor, it was a matter of handling, of technique, of practical wisdom that was missing in that sterile environment. The comforting lie that someone will handle it did not hold because she could see minute by minute that no one was handling anything at all. Then something different came from first class, a choking sound. The baby, from crying so much, seemed to be running out of air, slipping into a dangerous cycle of dry, panicked gasps. That was the final trigger. The fear of prejudice, the fear of exclusion, the fear of social position were still there, huge and frightening, but suddenly they became smaller than the fear of seeing that child suffer irreversible consequences. Leah's inner scale tipped toward humanity. She realized that the cost of doing nothing would be her own heavy conscience, and that was a burden she could not carry. The risk of being humiliated was bearable. The risk of being complicit through inaction was not. Leah took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the recycled air of the cabin as if preparing to dive into deep, unknown waters. She released the straps of her backpack, straightened her posture, and fixed her gaze on the curtain. Fear still made her legs tremble, her mouth was dry, and her hands were cold, but the decision had been made at the deepest level of her being. She knew she was about to enter the lion's den with no weapon other than her empty hands and her knowledge. The social barrier was there, solid and threatening, but Leah was about to test whether compassion could be a force strong enough to bring it down, or whether she would be crushed in the attempt. The metallic click of the seat belt being unfastened echoed in Leah's mind like the starting gun of a race she wasn't sure she could win. Her legs felt like they were made of lead as she stood up, defying gravity and the common sense that screamed at her to remain invisible and safe in her seat. Her heart pounded so hard against her ribs it felt as if it might burst out of her chest, pumping a dizzying mix of adrenaline and fear through her body. She adjusted her hoodie, pulling the sleeves down to cover her trembling hands, and took her first step into the aisle, drawing the curious glances of a few economy-class passengers who had stirred at her movement. That simple act of standing required more courage than any math exam she had ever faced, because here she was not being tested on what she knew, but on what she dared to do against every social odd. Walking down the narrow aisle of economy class felt like an endless journey, as if the floor of the plane stretched farther with every step she took. Leah kept her eyes fixed on the navy blue curtain ahead, turning that piece of fabric into her sole objective, trying to ignore the murmurs and background noise of the cabin. She felt like an unarmed soldier marching into battle, carrying only the certainty that her intervention was necessary. With every meter covered, the tension grew and doubt tried to pull her back. What are you going to say? What if they laugh at you? What if they throw you out? But the mental image of the suffering baby served as a beacon, guiding her through the fog of her own insecurity and pushing her feet forward, even as her instinct for self-preservation begged her to turn around and flee. When she reached the dividing curtain, Leah paused for a brief second, feeling the cold texture of the fabric under her fingers before pulling it aside. That physical barrier represented far more than a separation of classes. It was a portal between two worlds that were about to collide in an irreversible way. On one side, the reality of survival, on the other, the bubble of untouchable privilege. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the fabric and crossed the boundary, immediately sensing the change in atmosphere. The air felt colder, the smell of leather and expensive perfume filled her nostrils, and the soft, golden lighting clashed sharply with the harsh white light of economy. She had entered the lion's den, and now there was no turning back without being noticed. Leah's presence in first class was like a stone thrown into a calm lake, sending immediate shockwaves through the passengers. Heads turned in her direction, eyebrows lifted in surprise, and noses wrinkled in disapproval. She felt eyes scanning her from head to toe, judging her simple clothes, her hair, her skin color, instantly categorizing her as someone who did not belong there. The hostility was palpable, a wall of negative energy trying to push her back to where she came from. Leah had to fight the urge to hunch her shoulders and apologize for existing in that space. Instead, she lifted her chin, fixed her gaze toward the front of the cabin, and kept walking, projecting a confidence she was far from feeling. She moved forward along the carpeted aisle, deliberately ignoring the indignant murmurs beginning to rise around her. Who is this girl? Security should stop this. This is outrageous. The words reached her ears, but she blocked them out, focusing her hearing solely on the hoarse, exhausted crying coming from seat 1A. She was not there to make friends, not there to be accepted by the elite. She was there on a humanitarian rescue mission. That clarity of purpose gave her unexpected strength, an invisible armor that repelled the poison of prejudice. She walked with steady but light steps, trying not to make noise, passing like a shadow daring to defy the spotlight. A flight attendant, who had been crouched beside an elderly couple, noticed the intrusion and immediately shifted her posture, preparing to intercept Leah. The attendant's gaze was stern, professionally cold, and her mouth was already opening to deliver the standard line, "Miss, you can't be here." Leah caught the movement out of the corner of her eye, sensed the intent to block her, but did not slow down. She knew that if she stopped to explain herself, she would lose momentum and her chance. She needed to reach the father and the baby before bureaucracy grounded her. With subtle skill, she slightly altered her path, using the beverage cart as an obstacle in her favor, slipping past into the front of the cabin before the attendant could physically stop her. As she drew closer to the billionaire's seat, the scene of chaos came into painful high-definition focus. Renato had his back to her, hunched over his son, shoulders shaking with exhaustion, completely unaware of Leah's proximity. The smell of cold sweat and stress radiated from him, breaking the perfumed sterility of first class. The baby writhed, his face red and swollen from crying, emitting sobs that tore at the heart. Seeing it up close, without the filter of the curtain, confirmed all of Leah's suspicions and transformed her theoretical courage into absolute, practical determination. She was no longer a frightened girl from economy, she was the only person who knew what to do, and that technical certainty outweighed any social fear. Leah stopped a few steps from Renato, feeling the magnitude of the moment. She was about to intrude into the personal space of one of the most powerful men in the world, at his most vulnerable moment. The contrast was brutal. The girl who counted coins for her school lunch and the man who moved the GDP of nations, now leveled by the elemental biology of a baby in distress. She knew her approach had to be surgical. Any abrupt movement could be interpreted as aggression. She projected calm, authority, and empathy all at once, without a single arrogant word. Her hands were gentle, but her mind was cool and calculating, reviewing the steps of the technique she would apply the moment she was given permission. The silence around her was thick, loaded with malicious expectation. Other passengers stopped pretending to read their newspapers and tablets to watch the scene unfold, eager to see the girl humiliated and expelled. They saw Leah as a morbid curiosity, cheap entertainment for their tedious journey. But Leah gave them none of her attention. Her eyes were fixed on Renato and Kevin, creating a tunnel vision where nothing else mattered. She took one last deep breath, filling her lungs with that elite-conditioned air, and took the final step that placed her directly beside the CEO's seat, entering his peripheral vision. Renato, sensing a presence beside him, slowly turned his head, his eyes red and bloodshot with exhaustion meeting Leah's. For a second, time froze. There was no recognition, only shock. He saw a strange teenage girl, modestly dressed, standing there as if she belonged, looking at him not with judgment, but with an intensity he could not decipher. His mouth opened slightly, perhaps to dismiss her, perhaps to ask for help, but no words came out. The encounter had happened, and the final barrier between his despair and her solution was about to be broken by a single sentence Leah had rehearsed 1,000 times in her head during that walk. The universe seemed to freeze at the exact instant Renato's eyes met Leah's, creating a bubble of time where nothing else existed except the two of them and the babies crying. It was a scene worthy of a painting, but painted with the colors of absurdity. On one side, the billionaire on his leather throne, wearing clothes worth more than the girl's entire house, yet holding himself like a man who had lost everything. On the other, the teenager in a worn hoodie, scuffed sneakers, and hair pulled back without care, yet standing with the straight posture of someone who held the solution to the world's problem. The physical distance between them was only a few inches, but the social abyss it represented spanned light years. In that narrow first-class aisle, the logic of money ceased to exist, leaving only the raw encounter between a father's desperate need and a stranger's quiet courage. Renato blinked several times, trying to focus, his vision blurred by exhaustion, as if he could not believe the figure before him was real. For a brief moment, his worn-out mind wondered if she were a hallucination, a ghost created by stress, or perhaps a lost passenger who had wandered into the wrong cabin looking for the restroom. He expected to see security, a flight attendant, someone in uniform coming to remove her, but no one moved. Leah remained there, standing like a statue of determination, without asking permission, without lowering her head, without showing the fear he was used to inspiring in his subordinates. Her presence was so unexpected, so out of place in that luxurious environment, that Renato was left speechless, paralyzed by the complete rupture of the social protocol that governed his life. Leah, in turn, saw every detail of Renato's defeat with stark clarity. Up close, she could see beads of sweat running down his temple, the uncontrollable tremor in the fingers holding the baby, and the hollowness in his eyes that betrayed hours of psychological torture. She did not see the ruthless CEO from business magazines. She saw a dismantled human being, a father holding his child as if he were a bomb about to explode, unsure which wire to cut. The smell of fear and anxiety radiating from him was strong, overpowering the soft scent of leather and champagne. In that moment, Leah realized his power was an illusion. He was, in fact, the most fragile person on that plane, and with that realization, any trace of intimidation she might have felt vanished completely. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with unasked questions and urgent answers. Renato opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to ask, "Who are you?" or "What do you want?" But his voice failed, caught in his dry throat. He was used to giving orders, to demanding results, but there, before that unknown girl, he had no authority at all. He felt a deep shame at being seen in that state by someone inferior in social position, but his child's pain was greater than his ego. Leah, sensing his hesitation, held his gaze, projecting a magnetic calm, a stability he had not felt in hours. She was not there to judge, and to his surprise he began to feel that. It was the baby who broke the hypnotic trance of their encounter. Kevin let out a sharp scream, a cry of pain that made Renato's entire body seize in a spasm of anguish. The baby arched his back so forcefully that he nearly slipped from his father's sweaty arms. Renato tried to adjust his grip, clumsy, almost letting the child fall, and panic flashed in his eyes. It was in that near accident that the dynamic changed. Leah did not wait any longer. She did not ask for verbal permission or fill out a request form. She simply stepped forward, invading the billionaire's inviolable personal space, guided purely by a protective instinct louder than any etiquette. "He's in pain," Leah said, her voice low, steady, and surprisingly rough, cutting through the ambient noise like a sharp blade. It was not a question, it was a clinical statement. Renato looked at her, stunned by the simplicity and certainty of those words. No one in 3 hours had said that with such conviction. Everyone had said, "Make him stop," but Leah said, "He's in pain." That small shift in perspective hit Renato like a punch to the gut. In the girl's eyes, he saw not the pity he despised but technical knowledge, the confidence of someone who had seen this before and knew exactly how it ended. The tension in the cabin rose to stratospheric levels. Nearby passengers held their breath, waiting for the moment Renato would snap and order the girl out. A flight attendant stepped forward to intervene, but stopped when she saw the expression on the billionaire's face. Renato was fighting a violent internal battle between his wounded pride and his absolute desperation. Part of him, the arrogant part, wanted to reject the help of that poorly dressed, poor girl. But another part, the exhausted father, saw in her the last lifeline in a raging sea. He looked at his screaming son, looked at Leah with her open hands, and realized he had no more choices. Leah extended her arms in a universal gesture of welcome, palms up, waiting. She did not try to snatch the baby from him, she simply offered a safe harbor. "I know what he has. Let me help," she whispered, and there was an implicit promise in those words, a guarantee of peace Renato wanted more than any quarterly profit. The humility of the offer contrasted sharply with the arrogance of the environment, and that was exactly what disarmed Renato's defenses. He looked at her hands, working hands without a manicure, skin worn by labor, and for the first time in his life, he saw value where he would once have seen only invisibility. The moment of decision lasted a second that felt like an eternity. Renato felt the physical and emotional weight of Kevin become unbearable. His arms could not take it anymore. His mind could not take it anymore. He looked deep into Leah's brown eyes and saw a sincerity money could not buy. Surrendered, defeated, with no cards left to play, the most powerful man on the flight did the unthinkable. He relaxed his arms and guided his son's body toward the stranger. It was an act of blind faith, a leap into the dark driven by exhaustion. The physical contact was about to happen. The transfer of responsibility from a billionaire father to a teenage girl from the margins was unfolding under the incredulous eyes of the elite. Renato released the weight and Leah took the burden. The instant her skin touched the soft fabric of the baby's clothes and her arms wrapped around his contorted little body, a different energy began to flow, as if the static electricity of tension were about to be grounded. No one knew it, but that simple touch was milliseconds away from triggering a miracle that science and wealth had failed to achieve. At the exact moment when little Kevin's weight was transferred from Renato's tense arms to Leah's steady ones, a chemical shift seemed to occur in the cabin's atmosphere. It was not an awkward or uncertain handoff, it was a fluid motion, choreographed by the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Renato felt the hollow emptiness left in his lap, a physical lightness that clashed with the weight of fear in his mind, expecting the crying to intensify with the strangeness of the change. He held his breath, eyes wide, bracing for the explosive scream that would confirm his fatal mistake of trusting his son to a stranger. But Leah gave the baby no time to interpret the change of arms as a threat. She acted with instinctive speed, turning the child's body into an extension of her own, molding herself to his discomfort like water filling an empty space. Leah did not hold Kevin in the traditional rocking position that Renato and everyone else had tried unsuccessfully for hours. With a dexterity that seemed almost magical, she gently rotated the baby's body, laying him face down along her left forearm, letting his legs and arms hang freely. Kevin's head nestled securely into the crook of her elbow, firm and safe, while Leah's hand supported his belly with calculated, constant pressure. It was a technical, precise maneuver that inverted the logic of gravity and abdominal pressure. To outside observers, it looked like a strange, even uncomfortable position, but the baby's biology responded with immediate, visceral relief, confirming right there the release everyone had been searching for. The result was instantaneous, so fast that Renato's brain needed a few seconds to process what his ears, or rather the absence of sound, were registering. The piercing scream that had seemed endless was cut off abruptly, as if someone had pulled a plug or pressed a universal mute button. The baby released one last shaky breath, a surprised, hiccuping sound, and then, silence. A deep, absolute, shocking silence took over first class, filling the space where sonic chaos had ruled moments before. The only audible sound was the soft, steady hum of the jet engines, a white noise that suddenly felt like the most beautiful music in the world to everyone present. The scene was surreal. The girl in the hoodie stood in the middle of the luxurious aisle, holding the heir of billions in an unusual position, while the child lay completely still, surrendered to sudden comfort. Renato stared with his mouth slightly open, blinking in disbelief, trying to find a logical explanation for what he was witnessing. He had rocked, sung, offered toys, promised the world, and nothing had worked. She had simply touched him, turned him, and the crying stopped. It felt like witchcraft, a cheap magic trick, yet the peace on his son's face was undeniable. Kevin's twisted features of pain relaxed, the grimaces softened, and the clenched fists slowly opened, tiny fingers releasing the invisible air they had been desperately grasping. The first-class passengers, who moments earlier had been ready to morally lynch anyone responsible for the noise, now sat frozen in their seats, champagne flutes suspended in midair and forks halted halfway to their mouths. The collective shock was palpable. They looked at Leah no longer with disdain, but with genuine confusion and disbelief. How had that girl from the back, that invisible and unwanted figure, managed in 10 seconds what a powerful man and an entire crew had failed to do in 3 hours? Their silence was not one of respect, but of astonishment. Arrogance had been silenced along with the crying, replaced by a massive question mark hovering over the heads of every millionaire present. Leah, however, seemed oblivious to the impact she was causing. She did not look at the passengers seeking approval, nor did she glance triumphantly at Renato. All her attention was focused on the baby's breathing, monitoring his rhythm through skin-to-skin contact. She knew the silence was only the first step, the breaking of the hysteria cycle. His body was still tense, the colic pain still there, merely controlled by the pressure of her arm. She began to walk slowly within the small space, a barely perceptible sway, keeping a rhythm she knew to be hypnotic for the child's vestibular system. She was in a trance, connected to the baby on a frequency no one else could hear. The crew watching from the back of the cabin was just as stunned. The flight attendants exchanged discreet looks, relieved yet embarrassed. They were trained in first aid, etiquette, and crisis management, but none of them knew that trick. Watching a teenage economy-class passenger resolve the situation so effortlessly was a blow to their professional pride, but the relief of having silence restored outweighed any wounded ego. The captain, who may have been anticipating an emergency landing, must have sensed the shift in cabin pressure, because even the turbulence seemed to ease in respect for the moment. Renato felt his legs give way and sank back into his seat, not from relaxation, but because the adrenaline had suddenly drained from his system, leaving him weak. He looked at Leah as if she were a divine apparition. He wanted to speak, to thank her, to ask, how? But he feared that any sound might break the spell and bring the crying back. He simply watched, mesmerized by the simplicity of the act. There was no technology, no money involved, just anatomy and sensitivity. With devastating humility, he realized that his entire empire was worth nothing compared to that moment of peace a stranger was giving him for free. The baby, now secure and with his pain eased by the pressure on his abdomen, let out a deep sigh, the kind of sigh that comes when someone finally finds rest after an exhausting marathon. It was the sound of Leah's definitive victory. That small, satisfied noise was the final proof that she had not merely silenced the child, she had solved the problem. The miracle was not supernatural, it was purely human, born of empathy and experience. Leah had read the baby's body like an open book, while everyone else had been trying to read the instruction manual in a foreign language. But Leah knew the work was not finished. Silence was good, but to maintain calm and ensure the baby drifted into deep sleep, she needed to use the second part of her secret arsenal. The colic hold had addressed the physical pain, but the baby's mind still needed to be soothed, guided to a place of absolute safety. And that was when she began to do something that, to Renato's attentive ears, sounded like a forgotten and ancient memory, something that would add a new layer of emotion to that already unbelievable scene. What looked like a miracle to the passengers was, in fact, a precise application of physics and biology that Leah mastered like no one else. She kept her arm firm beneath Kevin's belly, applying constant, calculated pressure that gently massaged the baby's internal organs with each breath, helping release the trapped gas that caused such excruciating pain. It was not brute force, it was technique. A delicate balance between firmness to provide security and gentleness to avoid harm. Leah knew the secret was not only the position, but the confidence her hands conveyed. If she trembled or hesitated, the baby would sense it and start crying again, but she was solid as a rock, anchored in a certainty born from years of caring for her siblings, shaping her own body into a structure meant to absorb and ease the suffering of others. While maintaining the perfect technical position, Leah began to move in a slow, pendulum-like rhythm, a gentle sway that mimicked the motion inside a mother's womb. She was not standing still like a statue. She was dancing a silent, invisible waltz in the narrow aisle, shifting her weight from one leg to the other with a hypnotic cadence. This vestibular movement was essential to switch off the baby's alert system, signaling that everything was okay, that he was safe and in motion, something that instinctively calms any primate. Renato watched that minimalist ballet with fascination, realizing that he had tried to shake his son in desperation, while Leah rocked him with purpose, transforming agitation into calm through the simple geometry of human movement. But the physical technique was only half the cure. The other half came from somewhere much deeper and older. From deep in Leah's throat, a sound began to emerge, a low, vibrating hum that at first seemed like nothing more than air escaping her lungs. It was a deep, monotone murmur that resonated in her chest and transferred directly into the baby's body pressed against hers. That vibration worked like an internal massage, a sound frequency that competed with the jet engines and created a bubble of acoustic isolation for the child. Leah was not singing for the first-class audience. She was using her voice as a therapeutic tool, a technique she had learned by watching the women in her family soothe generations of crying babies. Gradually, the hum took shape and became a melody, a lullaby that existed in no Spotify playlist and on no state-of-the-art educational tablet. It was an old song with simple, repetitive words, speaking of rivers, winds, and peaceful sleep, an oral legacy left by her grandmother. Leah closed her eyes for a moment, transporting herself from that cold, luxurious cabin to the humble porch of her home, where she had seen her grandmother do exactly that so many times. She channeled the matriarch's energy, the infinite patience and unconditional love that lived within that song, bringing into the airplane the wisdom of someone who raised 10 children without a penny in her pocket, but with an ocean of affection in her heart. The soft melody filled the cabin's silence, a clear, unpretentious voice that clashed sharply with the surrounding opulence. It was not the voice of a professional singer, it was the voice of a caregiver, carrying an emotional truth that sent shivers down Renato's arms. He, who was accustomed to listening to operas in exclusive theaters, had never heard anything so beautiful and so effective. That simple song dismantled the baby's last defenses. Now free from pain, Kevin felt wrapped in a protective blanket of sound. His eyes, once wide with panic, began to grow heavy, blinking slowly as he surrendered to the sleep that arrived galloping to the rhythm of Leah's voice. For Leah, singing that song was an act of resistance and affirmation. There, in an environment where everything was bought and sold, she was offering something priceless: her people's culture, the wisdom of her ancestors. She felt the fear of judgment disappear completely, replaced by pride in knowing who she was and where she came from. The song was both her shield and her sword, declaring, "I belong to a lineage of strong women who know how to heal." She forgot she was surrounded by millionaires. In that moment, there was only her and the life she was protecting, bound together by an invisible thread woven from musical notes that traveled through time to save that moment. The effect on the baby was profoundly peaceful. Kevin's breathing, once short and frantic, synchronized with the rhythm of Leah's song, becoming deep and steady. His body went completely limp, a dead weight of total relaxation in the girl's arms. He was out, plunged into a deep, restorative sleep that seemed impossible just minutes earlier. The abdominal pressure removed the pain, the rocking removed the fear, and the song brought peace. It was a combination of folk wisdom that worked with the precision of a procedure, proving that human technology, the touch, the voice, the movement, remains the most advanced when it comes to caring for another human being. Renato looked at his sleeping son and felt an uncontrollable urge to cry, not from despair, but from relief and gratitude. He saw Kevin's little hand fall loosely to the side, the universal sign that the battle was over. He looked at Leah and saw a giant. The wisdom she carried was not written in diplomas, it was etched into her DNA, into her lived experience, into her ability to feel another person. He saw how limited his own world was, where everything was solved with credit cards, and how vast and rich the world of that girl was, where problems were solved with soul and presence. The airplane seemed to have entered another dimension. Leah's song, even when whispered, had a penetrating power that silenced even the cynical thoughts of the other passengers. The rustic simplicity of that scene, a poor girl rocking a rich baby with an old lullaby, exposed the artificiality of everything around them. The leather, the champagne, The jewelry all felt trivial compared to the raw power of that act of care. Leah's inherited wisdom did not just save the flight, it gently humbled the arrogance of modernity, showing that some things never change and should never be forgotten. With Kevin sleeping deeply, Leah slowly stopped singing, lowering the volume back to a hum and then to silence. She continued the gentle sway, making sure the sleep was stable. She opened her eyes and saw that the landscape around her had changed. The atmosphere in the cabin was no longer one of judgment or condemnation. Something new had appeared in the eyes of those people. The contempt had evaporated, giving way to a feeling that the elite had rarely experienced toward someone like Leah, and that new dynamic was about to transform the rest of that flight into something unforgettable. The silence that now reigned in the first-class cabin was not merely the absence of noise. It was an invisible monument built by Leah's hands, a structure of peace that left every passenger in a state of reverent shock. Those same faces that minutes earlier had been twisted into masks of disgust, impatience, and contempt now wore an almost comical expression of disbelief. The passengers seemed to have been shaken awake from a collective trance of selfishness, forced to witness that the solution to their big problem did not come from the captain, did not come from money, and did not come from authority, but from the very teenager they had ignored moments before. The atmosphere, once charged with hostile electricity, softened instantly, turning the cabin into a temple of calm where Leah was, without question, the unexpected priestess who had worked the miracle. The woman covered in jewelry who had threatened to sue the airline, lowered her sleep mask and stared at Leah with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open in a mix of shame and admiration. The executive with the laptop who had tapped his fingers in fury, now sat motionless, watching the scene with reluctant respect, like someone recognizing a masterful chess move even though it came from an opponent he had underestimated. The arrogance of the elite suffered a crushing defeat. They had been saved by someone they considered inferior, and that irony hung heavy and undeniable in the air. There were no more calls of, "Get her out of here." Now, eyes followed every movement Leah made with hypnotic fascination, as if they feared that looking away might break the spell and bring the nightmare back. A tangible shift occurred in everyone's body language. People adjusted themselves in their seats, no longer to distance themselves from the problem, but to observe the solution more closely. Curiosity replaced disgust. They began to see Leah not as an economy-class intruder, but as a baby whisperer, a specialist endowed with a rare gift. Racial and social prejudice, though not erased, was momentarily suffocated by pragmatic gratitude. That girl had given them back the comfort they had paid for, and in their world, results mattered more than origins. They were witnessing raw competence triumph over status, and even with hardened hearts, they could not deny the effectiveness unfolding right in front of them. The silent judgment turned into a kind of veiled collective guilt. Some passengers looked away when Leah's gaze passed over them, unable to hold the stare of the girl they had prematurely condemned. They realized, perhaps for the first time in a long while, how useless their fortunes were in the face of basic human biology. All the power concentrated in that cabin, millions in stocks, properties, luxury cars, had failed against the distress of a 6-month-old baby. It took the calloused hands and gentle voice of a humble girl to solve it. That subtle act was a cold dish of humiliation they were forced to swallow, while the sleeping baby stood as living proof of their own incompetence. Even the crew, usually trained to maintain a neutral posture, could not hide their relieved smiles and approving looks. The flight attendants watched Leah with professional gratitude, knowing she had saved them from a hellish flight full of formal complaints. The same crew members who had been ready to block the girl's passage now brought her water with a deference usually reserved for VIP passengers. The hierarchy of the airplane had been overturned. Moral authority now rested with Leah. She did not need a uniform or a first-class ticket to command respect in that space. She had earned it in practice on the battlefield of real stress. Renato, watching the reaction of the other passengers, felt a wave of complex emotion wash over him. He saw the contempt in their eyes turn into envy, yes, envy that he, the failed father, now had beside him the most capable person on the entire flight. He saw how the looks shifted from "make that baby shut up" to "how did she do that?" That external validation, coming from the very people who had judged him, confirmed what he already felt inside. That girl was special. He felt, strangely, protected by her presence, as if Leah's competence created a shield around him and his son, repelling the negativity that had crushed him for hours. The moment served as a moral slap for those people. Life, with its peculiar sense of humor, had placed salvation in the hands of the person they despised, forcing them to reconsider their beliefs, even if only briefly. Leah, in her old hoodie, now seemed more noble than anyone there in Italian suits. She carried the baby like a trophy of peace, moving gently down the aisle, and each step she took was a silent lesson in humility for the wealthy audience. They were forced to consider that a person's value does not lie in the label on their clothes, but in what they are capable of doing when chaos erupts and money fails. The whispers returned, but now in a different tone. "Incredible," someone murmured. "She must be a professional nanny," another speculated, trying to find a logical explanation that fit their limited worldview. They tried to categorize Leah, to place her in a box that made sense to them, refusing to accept that it might simply be talent and humanity. But no matter what label they tried to stick on her, the fact remained. The plane was silent, the baby was asleep, and the girl from economy class was the sole reason for it. The admiration was reluctant, but real, born from the selfish relief of being able to sip their wine in peace again. Leah, however, was not seduced by this change in attitude. She knew that this respect was fragile, conditional on her usefulness in that moment. She was not seeking applause. She was seeking Kevin's well-being. Still, she felt the shift in energy, sensed the environment grow lighter, and allowed her shoulders to relax slightly, knowing the battle against hostility had been won. She looked at Renato, who still stared at her as if she were an angel, and saw in him a genuine gratitude that differed from the superficial admiration of the others. There, between the father and the rescuer, something deeper was forming, a connection that went beyond the fleeting moment. And it was in this post-storm calm, as passengers timidly returned to their routines of luxury and silence was once again celebrated like gold, that Renato, regaining his breath and his ability to think clearly, decided he needed to know more. Curiosity, now free of panic, began to bubble in his mind. Who was that girl? Where did such wisdom come from? He glanced at the old backpack she had set down beside the seat, and something about it caught his attention. A clue suggesting that Leah's skill with babies was only the tip of an iceberg far larger and even more surprising, one that was about to be revealed. With the emotional storm finally dissipated and little Kevin sleeping like an angel in Leah's arms, Renato's adrenaline began to fade, giving way to the analytical curiosity that was the trademark of his career. He now observed the girl with different eyes, no longer as a desperate lifeline, but as a fascinating enigma he needed to decipher. Who was that teenager who had the touch of an experienced mother and the calm of a Tibetan monk? His gaze fell on the old worn backpack Leah had carelessly left on the floor of the aisle when she rushed to help him. That object, with its faded fabric and jammed zippers, told a story of struggle and deprivation, clashing violently with the pristine carpet of first class. But something sticking out of the side pocket caught the CEO's attention, the corner of a thick spiral notebook, its pages yellowed and marked by heavy use. Driven by an almost involuntary impulse, Renato leaned slightly forward and picked up the notebook, expecting to find perhaps teenage doodles, song lyrics, or basic school notes. But when he opened the soft cardboard cover, what his eyes found made his jaw metaphorically drop once again on that flight. The pages were not filled with trivialities. They were a dense, complex battlefield of numbers, hand-drawn three-dimensional graphs, and equations dancing in chaotic yet beautiful patterns. This was not high school math. It was advanced calculus, chaos theory, non-Euclidean geometry, and algorithms that Renato, even with his MBA in finance, could barely recognize, let alone understand. The margins were packed with frantic notes, arrows connecting ideas and forceful corrections, revealing a mind operating at a dizzying speed. He flipped through the pages with growing reverence, feeling the texture of the cheap paper that housed ideas of incalculable value. There was an aesthetic beauty in those formulas, a logical organization that sharply contrasted with the humble appearance of their author. Renato looked at Leah, still gently rocking the baby, and tried to reconcile the two images. The perfect babysitter, singing ancestral lullabies, and the brilliant mind capable of dismantling complex mathematical problems. It was like discovering that the janitor in your building was, in fact, a nuclear physicist in his spare time. The duality was shocking. That girl was not only emotionally intuitive. She was an intellectual prodigy, one of those statistical rarities born once in a generation, hidden beneath an oversized hoodie and society's prejudice. "Is this yours?" Renato asked, his voice still hoarse, pointing to the open notebook on a page that looked like it contained the solution to quantum gravity. Leah snapped out of her meditative trance, glanced at the object in his hands and blushed deeply, the redness climbing up her neck. She reached to take the notebook back, embarrassed as if she had been caught doing something wrong. "Oh, they're just some scribbles. Silly stuff, a pastime," she said, trying to downplay its importance with a humility that bordered on self-erasure. She was used to hiding her intelligence so as not to seem weird or arrogant in her world, and that defensive reflex surfaced immediately in front of the wealthy man in the suit. But Renato did not accept the evasion. He knew how to recognize talent when he saw it. That was his job, identifying potential in companies and people. This is not a pastime, girl. This is PhD-level work. What are you doing with triple integrals and probability theory at your age? He pressed, genuinely astonished. Realizing he was not mocking her but admiring her, Leah relaxed her shoulders slightly. She explained softly that she saw numbers as patterns like music. To her, solving a complex equation was the same as finding the right tone to calm a baby. It was all about finding harmony where chaos existed. Her explanation was as poetic as it was technical, revealing a way of thinking that transcended cold logic and touched art. That was when the true reason for her journey came to light. Leah was not flying to London for leisure or to visit distant relatives. She was on her way to the International Mathematical Olympiad, the most prestigious competition in the world for young talents, where the sharpest minds on the planet gathered to solve problems considered impossible. She had been selected to represent her country, one of the few to achieve that coming from a public school in a poor neighborhood. That notebook was not just a pastime. It was her passport to the future, her only chance to change her family's reality through the pure power of intellect. Renato listened to her story with a mix of fascination and shame. He thought about how he had mentally judged her when he first saw her, and how the world treated her. She was a genius, an immensely valuable human resource, traveling squeezed into economy class, invisible, while people with half her ability lounged in first class simply because they had been born into privilege. The revelation completely reshaped Renato's understanding of the concept of elite. The elite was right there, holding his own child, wearing donated clothes and eating reheated airplane food. He realized he was facing a rough diamond the system had failed to polish, yet one that shone intensely despite all the dirt thrown on it. The conversation flowed into details about the competition. Leah spoke of sleepless nights studying with borrowed library books, of the lack of teachers able to keep up with her reasoning, of how she had to teach herself most of those complex theories by watching old YouTube videos in an internet cafe. Her resilience was as impressive as her intelligence. She did not see herself as a victim. She saw herself as a fighter who used her brain as a weapon. Renato, who had always prided himself on his hard work, felt small in comparison. His effort to maintain his fortune seemed like child's play next to her struggle just to earn a seat at the table. As she talked about fractals and Fibonacci sequences with a spark in her eyes that lit up her tired face, Renato noticed something else. She was nervous. Not about the plane but about what awaited her in London. She carried the weight of an entire community's expectations, the fear of failing and having to return to invisibility. What if I'm not good enough? She let slip in a moment of vulnerability. Renato looked at the formulas in the notebook, then at the peaceful face of his son, and felt like laughing at the irony. She had already proven she was more than good enough. She had solved the hardest problem on the flight without using a calculator. The discovery of Leah's genius forged a new bond between them. Now Renato saw her not only with gratitude, but with deep intellectual respect. He wanted to know more, to understand how her mind worked, but above all, he felt a growing discomfort, an indignation bubbling in his stomach. How was it possible that a girl with such potential was in such a precarious situation? The contrast between the brilliance of her mind and the poverty of her material resources was a glitch in the system that Renato, with all his power, felt compelled to correct. But before that, he would be confronted with the brutal reality of how she had managed to get there. When Renato, driven by obvious curiosity, asked how a student with no resources was managing an international trip to London, Leah's answer hit his privileged conscience like a bucket of ice-cold water. She didn't talk about government scholarships or major corporate sponsorships. She talked about raffles for blenders, selling cake in a jar at the school gate, and a community fundraiser that mobilized the entire neighborhood. Every cent of that plane ticket had been sweated over, counted, and saved by people who barely had enough for themselves, but who believed in her future. Leah explained, with disarming simplicity, that one neighbor gave the money meant for cooking gas, the baker donated the loose change from his register, and the local church organized a charity bingo. That trip wasn't a luxury. It was a collective investment of hope, in which an entire community placed its savings into that girl's backpack, betting that she would be the one capable of breaking the cycle of poverty and bringing pride to all of them. Renato listened with a knot tightening in his throat with every harsh detail of her daily struggle. He made a quick, cruel calculation in his head. The cost of her ticket, which had taken months of collective effort to pay for, was the same amount he spent on a single business dinner or on one bottle of wine he didn't even finish. The disparity was obscene. He ran a corporation valued at $8 billion, where money flowed like water, often invested in useless bureaucracy or corporate whims. While he signed million-dollar checks without blinking, Leah had to calculate whether she could buy a bottle of water at the airport without compromising her survival budget in London. That brutal contrast between his abundance and her scarcity suddenly made all his wealth feel dirty and unjust, an accumulation of resources that made no sense in the face of such glaring inequality. The gap between their worlds became even more evident in the small physical details Renato could no longer ignore. He looked at his own wrist, where a limited edition Swiss watch rested, a piece of engineering that cost more than the house where Leah probably lived with her entire family. Then he looked at Leah's sneakers, the soles worn thin from walking to save on bus fare, and at her hoodie, which had lost its original color after countless washes. Those objects were not just belongings. They were social markers screaming the astronomical distance between their realities. He traveled with designer luggage full of clothes he might never wear. She traveled with a patched backpack carrying the weight of hundreds of people's dreams. The visual injustice was so strong it was almost physically painful for Renato, dismantling any meritocracy argument he might once have used to justify his success. Leah continued speaking without complaint, simply stating facts, explaining that her stay in London would be in a cheap hostel, in a shared room with 8 strangers, and that she had packed instant noodles in her suitcase to avoid spending money on food. She talked about these hardships as if they were just normal logistical obstacles, unaware of how absurd it was that a national representative in an intellectual Olympiad had to risk hunger just to compete. Renato felt deep shame, not for himself alone but for the system he represented. How could the world allow a talent of that caliber to be treated with such neglect? He realized that for Leah the competition hadn't started with the math test. The competition was life itself, a daily fight just to reach the starting line where people like him were born already waiting for the starting gun. Leah's situation was terrifyingly fragile. Renato knew he had an endless safety net. If he failed in a deal, he had lawyers, insurance and bank reserves to cushion the fall. Leah, on the other hand, was walking a tightrope with no net below. If she missed the flight, got sick, or was robbed, the dream would end instantly and the community's money would be lost forever. She had no margin for error, no plan B. The immense psychological pressure of knowing that one wrong step would destroy not only her life, but the faith of everyone who had helped her, was a burden no teenager should ever carry. And yet, there she was, holding his child and smiling, showing a strength of character that Renato knew many of his executives would never possess. In that moment, the concept of value was redefined in the billionaire's mind. He had always measured value in assets, stocks, and net profits. But looking at Leah, he saw the value of resilience, solidarity, and pure courage. The money from those raffles was worth more than his billions, because every dollar carried sweat, sacrifice, and love. He felt spiritually poor in the face of that girl's human wealth. He had everything, yet at that moment felt he had nothing of real importance to offer, except perhaps his financial influence. The helplessness he had felt during his baby's crying transformed into a sense of urgent social responsibility. He couldn't just listen to her story, land the plane, and say, "Good luck." That would be criminal complicity with the cruel fate trying to crush her. Renato looked at the math notebook again, at those complex equations drawn with a cheap, chewed-up pen. He imagined the potential of that mind if it had access to the best computers, the best books, the best mentors. The waste of human talent was the greatest sin he could identify in that moment. He thought of how many other Lias existed in the world, never discovered because they were too busy surviving hunger or lack of transportation. Leah was a survivor who had broken through the barrier, but at what cost? The exhaustion in her eyes wasn't just from the flight. It was the exhaustion of a lifetime spent swimming against the powerful current of social inequality. The conversation also revealed that Leah didn't even have a proper coat for the European winter. She was heading into London's cold with clothes meant for Brazil's tropical climate, trusting that the adrenaline of competition would keep her warm. Renato shivered, thinking of the cashmere coat folded in the overhead bin, a piece he wore casually that cost thousands of dollars. The disparity in protection was literal. He was insulated from the world. She was exposed to every element. That physical vulnerability awakened in him a protective instinct that went beyond gratitude for his son. He wanted to cover that gap, to use his power to level such an unfair playing field. The silence that followed Leah's account was heavy, loaded with reflection. Renato could no longer look at her simply as the savior of the flight. She was a mirror reflecting the failures of the society that had made him rich. He realized that their meeting wasn't just a logistical coincidence. It was a call to action. He owed her something that couldn't be paid with a simple thank you. The universe had placed the solution to his problems in her hands, and now, perhaps, it was his turn to be a solution to hers. The exchange wouldn't be financial. It would be an exchange of destinies. As the plane began its descent procedures into London, breaking through the clouds and approaching the reality of the ground, Renato's mind, accustomed to closing major deals, started to formulate a proposal. It wasn't charity. He wouldn't insult her dignity with handouts. It was a value transaction, a recognition of competence. He needed her as much as she needed resources, and that newly discovered interdependence was about to turn into an offer that would change the course of both their lives, transforming that brutal contrast into an innovative and powerful partnership. As the plane began its final landing procedures, piercing the dense layer of gray clouds typical of London, Renato Garcia's mind was operating on two simultaneous levels of panic and strategy. The panic was fueled by the terrifying prospect of disembarking in a strange city, alone with a baby who could start crying again at any moment as soon as Leah's magical arms moved away. The strategic level, in turn, calculated the risks of the crucial meetings he would have over the next 48 hours, merger negotiations that would define the future of his empire and demand total focus, something impossible with a crying baby in his arms. He glanced at his tablet agenda, packed with appointments with ruthless bankers and investors, and realized that bringing Kevin into those settings would be corporate suicide. He needed an immediate logistical solution, and that solution was sitting right beside him, holding the problem itself with enviable calm. Renato knew he couldn't simply hire an unknown nanny in London at the last minute. Trust takes time to build, and he didn't have time. He had already seen Leah's competence in action, tested under the extreme pressure of 35,000 feet. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was a whisperer, someone who spoke his son's language. The decision was made with the speed of an investor spotting a golden opportunity before the market caught on. He needed to secure her services, not out of charity, but out of a pragmatic and urgent need for professional survival. To Renato, Leah had become the most valuable asset on that trip, and he was willing to pay market price for that temporary exclusivity. When the fasten seat belts sign lit up and the landing gear locked into place with a dull thud, Renato turned to Leah with the posture of someone about to close the deal of a lifetime. He didn't use the condescending tone of someone offering help. He used the respectful tone of someone proposing a partnership. "Leah, I have a business proposal for you," he said bluntly, cutting through any unnecessary formality. He saw her eyes widen in surprise but remain steady. "I have critical meetings over the next 2 days. I can't walk into a boardroom with Kevin crying, and I don't trust anyone else in this city to take care of him. I saw what you did. You have a gift, and I need that gift right now just as much as I need to close those contracts." The proposal was bold and completely unconventional. Renato wanted to hire Leah to be Kevin's shadow during his stay in London. She would be housed in the same 5-star hotel as him, in a separate room, of course. All her food and transportation expenses would be covered, and her sole responsibility would be to keep the baby calm, fed, and safe while he attended his meetings. In exchange, he offered an amount in British pounds that momentarily took Leah's breath away. It wasn't just fair pay. It was enough to cover her entire stay in Europe, buy proper winter clothes, pay her college enrollment back home, and still have enough left to return the raffle money to her community. Leah listened to the offer as if it were spoken in a foreign language. Her mind, accustomed to surviving on instant noodles and crowded hostels, couldn't process the sudden shift in reality. Working for a billionaire? Staying in a luxury hotel? It sounded like something out of a movie, too good to be true, and her survival instincts, hardened by a difficult life, immediately raised a red flag. "But I came for the competition, sir. I have to study. I have schedules," she stammered, trying to keep her focus on her main goal. Her loyalty to her Olympic dream was unshakable, and the fear of straying from it, even for a lot of money, was real. She didn't want to be seen as someone who sold out and forgot the purpose of the trip. Sensing her ethical hesitation, Renato adjusted the offer with the skill of an experienced negotiator. "I don't want to buy your study time, Leah. My meetings are during the day. At night you're free. And at the hotel you'll have high-speed internet, room service, silence, and a real desk to study at, far better than any noisy hostel bunk bed." He was selling comfort and infrastructure, the two things she needed most to perform well. He argued that by accepting the job, she would actually be investing in her own victory, eliminating the stress of hunger and physical discomfort so she could focus exclusively on mathematics. Renato's logic was flawless, and it hit Leah squarely. She looked down at the notebook on her lap, imagining how difficult it would be to concentrate in a room with 8 strangers while worrying about lunch money. His offer would solve all her logistical problems at once. It was a fair exchange. She gave him the piece he needed to work and he gave her the piece she needed to study. It wasn't a handout. It was a symbiosis. She looked at the baby sleeping in her arms, feeling genuine affection for him, and realized that caring for Kevin wouldn't be a burden, but a welcome pause from the pressure of numbers. Renato pulled a heavy business card with gold embossing and a fountain pen from his jacket pocket. Right there, on the fold-out table in first class, he sketched the terms of the informal agreement, turning the conversation into a tangible commitment. This covers everything, Leah. Clothes, food, transportation. You won't have to spend a single cent of your community's money. You'll go home not only with a medal, but with the dignity of having supported yourself professionally. He struck her weak point. Her pride in not depending on anyone. He was offering her the chance to be her own provider, to validate her competence in a high-level job market, even if the role was unexpected. The aircraft touched down with a jolt, and the roar of the reverse engines signaled their arrival in London. For the other passengers, it was just the end of a flight. For Leah, it was the beginning of a massive moral and practical dilemma. The money offered was right there, within reach, a magical solution to all her sleepless nights worrying about finances. But accepting it meant stepping even deeper into that man's world, a world where she didn't belong and whose rules she didn't know. The fear of being dazzled, of losing focus, of being swallowed by that seductive luxury battled with the pragmatic need to accept the help. Renato extended his hand to seal the deal, his gaze locked onto hers, waiting for an answer before the doors opened and the magic of the flight dissolved into immigration bureaucracy. It's a one-time offer, Leah. Take it or leave it. I need you, and honestly, you need this structure to win that competition. His blunt honesty was the final blow. Leah looked at the billionaire's outstretched hand, then at her own calloused one, and felt the full weight of her choice. Accepting would solve everything immediately, but it would also bring a new kind of pressure she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Leah held the business card as if it were a ticking time bomb. The decision had to be made now in the next few seconds. Her destiny and that baby's were intertwined by a financial proposal that could become a lever for her success or a distraction leading to failure. Her heart raced, no longer from fear of flying, but from the dizzying fear of seeing her life change completely with a single word, yes. Renato's gold-embossed business card weighed in Leah's hand as if it were made of lead, burning her fingertips with the promise of a life she had never dared to dream of. As the line to disembark began to form in the aisle, the girl's mind turned into a noisy courtroom, where prosecution and defense shouted contradictory arguments. On one side, the seductive voice of comfort, sleeping on Egyptian cotton sheets, eating hot meals, enjoying high-pressure showers and absolute silence to study. On the other, the stern voice of guilt and duty. She wasn't there to play Cinderella, she was there on a nearly sacred mission. Accepting that money felt, in some distorted way, like a betrayal of the honest simplicity she came from. Would she be able to keep her eye of the tiger, the hunger to win, if she were surrounded by luxuries that soften the spirit? The fear of being dazzled and losing focus on mathematics was a real ghost haunting her. Leah thought of Donna Maria, the neighbor who sold her iron to help with the fundraiser. She thought of Seu Zay from the bakery, who donated the loose change from his register week after week. The tired yet hopeful faces of her community played like a movie in her mind. If she accepted staying in a 5-star hotel, would she be spitting on their sacrifices? Or would she be honoring them by ensuring the best possible conditions to bring the medal home? The line between selling out and being strategic was thin and blurred. She felt that by entering Renato's world she might lose her identity as a warrior from the outskirts, which was her emotional fuel. Money offers ease, but hardship had always been her most faithful teacher. Abandoning the daily struggle for survival felt, paradoxically, dangerous for an intellect honed on stone. However, biological reality began to present its own irrefutable arguments. Leah's stomach growled softly, reminding her that the last packet of crackers had been eaten hours ago and that her food reserve in her bag was limited to instant noodles. She looked out the plane window and saw London's cold, fine rain battering the runway, imagining herself dragging her old suitcase through icy streets to reach a cheap hostel that, according to online reviews, had heating and noise problems. How would she solve differential equations while shivering with cold and hunger? Mathematics, her greatest ally, began calculating probabilities. Her chances of winning the Olympiad would drop significantly if she were exhausted and sick. The comfort Renato was offering was not superfluous luxury in that context. It was performance infrastructure. Renato's proposal also carried a sense of professional dignity Leah had never experienced. He wasn't giving her money. He was paying for a specialized service that only she could provide. He needed her. That reversal of roles was powerful. She wouldn't be a freeloader in his life. She would be an essential employee. That helped ease the feeling of receiving charity. She looked at Kevin sleeping peacefully, and felt that leaving him now, knowing he would likely cry and suffer again without proper care, would be a cruelty she couldn't morally justify. Fate had placed that baby in her path for a reason, and refusing to help him just to prove a point about humility felt like selfishness disguised as virtue. Still, fear of the unknown froze her legs. Getting into a billionaire's car and entering a world of opulence meant crossing a portal with no guarantee of return. What if she got used to it? What if, after tasting caviar, she could no longer swallow dry bread? The conflict was about preserving her essence. She feared money would corrupt the purity of her purpose. She was there for mathematics, for science, for the truth of numbers, not to be a luxury nanny. The doubt hammered relentlessly. Is this a test of fate to see if I stay true to my principles, or is it a victory disguised as a job opportunity? The answer wasn't in the books she had read. It was in the intuition she needed to access right then. The flow of passengers began pushing her toward the exit, forcing a physical decision. Renato was already standing, putting on his impeccable coat, adjusting the child in his arms with an anxious look of expectation. He wasn't pressuring her with words anymore, but his body language screamed urgency. He was offering her a key to open every door that had been locked to her, and Leah hesitated to turn the knob. She looked at her own hands, saw ink stains on her fingers, and remembered that intelligence is, above all, the ability to adapt. Refusing resources that could guarantee her victory would be stupidity, not honor. A true warrior uses every weapon available on the battlefield. Then came a moment of sudden clarity, when cold logic defeated emotional fear. Leah realized that accepting the proposal wouldn't change who she was. It would only change where she slept. The community's money could be saved, returned, or used for something even greater later. If she won the competition, no one would care whether she slept in a hostel or a palace. They would care only about the medal on her chest. Success was the greatest form of gratitude she could offer. With this new perspective, the weight of guilt began to lift, replaced by pragmatic determination. She would use Renato's money as a step upward, not as a place to rest. She took a deep breath, feeling the airplane's air conditioning one last time, and looked into Renato's eyes. There was a new firmness in her, the posture of someone about to close a contract between equals. I accept, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. But with one condition: my studies are the absolute priority. If the work interferes with my preparation for the competition, I pick up my backpack and go to my hostel immediately. She set boundaries, claimed her territory. Renato gave a sincere smile of genuine respect and nodded. He knew he had just hired not merely a nanny but a force of nature. The handshake that sealed the agreement was firm, sealing an explicit pact between capital and intellect. Leah picked up her old backpack from the floor, feeling that financial uncertainty had been removed from the equation. She wasn't selling herself. She was being funded. It was an unofficial scholarship, granted by fate in exchange for her humanity. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and took her first step toward the crew door, ready to face London's cold, now protected by a new armor of resources she had never imagined possessing. As they exited the plane and stepped into the icy jet bridge at Heathrow Airport, the reality of her decision began to materialize. The cold wind cut across her face, but Leah knew she wouldn't be cold that night. She walked beside the most powerful man on that flight, not as a shadow but as an essential partner. Yet as they moved through the endless corridors of immigration, Leah had no idea that the real test wouldn't be luxury or comfort, but the violent cultural shock waiting for her the moment the airport's automatic doors opened to the exclusive and intimidating world she was about to plunge into headfirst. Leah's arrival in London was nothing like what she had imagined in her most distant dreams. There were no tourist buses or soggy paper maps in the rain. Instead, there was a uniformed driver opening the door of a sleek black luxury car, its interior scented with new leather and polished wood, an acoustic silence that shut out the urban chaos outside. As the vehicle glided through the wet, gray streets of the English capital, Leah pressed her face against the tinted window, watching Big Ben and Parliament blur past as streaks of history and power. She clutched her old backpack tightly in her lap, as if that worn piece of fabric were the only anchor keeping her connected to reality, while Renato, beside her, was already on the phone, speaking rapid, aggressive English, instantly switching into shark mode. The city outside looked cold and intimidating, but inside that bubble of wealth, the temperature was perfectly controlled, creating a cognitive dissonance that left Leah dizzy. When the car stopped in front of the hotel, a historic palace in the heart of the city, Leah felt her legs tremble again. The place radiated an imposing presence that made anyone feel small. Marble columns, uniformed doormen, and a red carpet that seemed to scream, "You don't belong here." As she stepped out, she caught the discreet yet judgmental looks of staff and guests, analyzing her simple clothes in contrast to Renato's elegance. She was a visual anomaly in that ecosystem of haute couture and understated jewelry. Yet Renato's presence beside her, moving with the authority of someone who owned the world, acted as a shield. He didn't apologize for her being there. He guided her through the gilded lobby with the natural ease of someone escorting a senior executive, forcing the world around them to swallow its prejudice and make way. The presidential suite they were taken to was larger than Leah's entire home and those of her neighbors combined. Crystal chandeliers, velvet sofas, original artwork on the walls, and a panoramic view of the River Thames that cost a fortune per night filled the space. Leah stood frozen in the middle of the room, afraid to touch anything and break it, feeling like an intruder in a museum. Renato, however, had no time for awe. He immediately turned the suite's living room into a command center, spreading documents across the mahogany table and connecting laptops. To him, that luxury was merely work infrastructure. To Leah, it was a violent cultural shock. She was set up in an adjoining room, luxurious and silent, but with the door open to the main room where the fate of Renato's company would be decided in the coming hours. The next morning brought a stark confrontation between two worlds. While Renato donned his battle armor, a perfectly tailored, severe suit, to receive bankers and lawyers, Leah put on her battle hoodie and prepared Kevin's bottle. The suite was invaded by businessmen with tense expressions, leather briefcases, and an aura of palpable stress. The air grew heavy with financial jargon, billion-dollar figures, and veiled threats of hostile takeovers. In the midst of that corporate hurricane, in a strategic corner of the room, Leah sat on the floor atop a Persian rug, creating an island of peace. Her mission was insane and double-edged: to keep the baby in absolute silence so as not to disrupt an $8 billion negotiation, and at the same time review the most complex mathematical theories in the world for an exam happening the next day. The contrast was cinematic, almost poetic. On one side of the room, Renato shouted orders, debated contractual clauses, and sweated under the pressure of potentially losing his empire. On the other, just meters away, Leah gently rocked the stroller with her foot while solving triple integrals in her battered notebook. Two kinds of extreme pressure coexisted in the same space: the pressure of capital and the pressure of intellect. Leah needed total focus to understand algebraic topology, yet her hawk-like eyes never left the baby. At every whimper from Kevin, she acted with ninja-like precision, anticipating the cry and neutralizing it with a touch or a movement, ensuring Renato's meeting continued uninterrupted. She was the silent guardian of his success. As the hours passed, the level of difficulty increased for both of them. Renato's negotiations hit a brutal impasse, voices rising and fists slamming on the table. The tension in the air was toxic, saturated with testosterone and fear. Kevin, sensitive to the environment, began to grow restless, absorbing his father's stress. Leah had to use her entire repertoire of calm, whispering almost inaudible songs and using her own body as an energetic barrier. At the same time, she ran into a combinatorial geometry problem in her studies that seemed unsolvable, a mental wall that made her doubt her own ability. She was fighting two wars at once, soothing a baby's biology and taming the abstract logic of the universe, all while feeling like an ant among financial giants. There was a moment when Renato, exhausted and cornered by investors, glanced toward the corner of the room seeking a breath. He saw Leah. He saw the girl with a pen between her teeth, brow furrowed in concentration, one hand holding her notebook and the other gently stroking his son's head. That image, so focused and so serene amid the chaos he himself had created, became an anchor for his sanity. He realized that her problem, unraveling the secrets of pure mathematics, was in a way far more noble and difficult than the fight over money he was waging. That vision gave him sudden perspective, a cold calm he used to turn the negotiation around, surprising the bankers with a bold proposal he would never have conceived had he remained blinded by stress. When night fell and the executives finally left, taking with them the smell of strong coffee and dissipated tension, the suite sank into silence. Renato collapsed onto the sofa, victorious but drained. Leah, however, was not finished. Kevin slept, but her mind was wide awake, vibrating with the adrenaline of study. She had kept the baby calm and happy, allowed Renato to save his company, but now she was alone with the monster of the Olympiad. The exam was the next morning. The hotel's luxury, the good food, the hot shower, all of it had helped, but now it was her against the paper. A doubt, that old enemy, whispered again, "Are you ready? Did this world distract you?" Leah looked out at the illuminated view of London, a city that had produced geniuses like Newton and Turing, and felt the weight of history on her shoulders. She wasn't there just to compete, she was there to prove that genius has no zip code. Renato, watching her from the shadows, realized that the true battle of that trip had never been his. His was for money and power, things that come and go. Hers was for identity and future. He saw in her eyes the dangerous glow of someone about to step into an arena of intellectual gladiators, where there are no draws, only glory or oblivion. Dinner was served in the room, a gourmet meal Leah ate with the hunger of someone who needed fuel for her brain. Renato wanted to talk, to thank her, but he realized she was no longer really there. Leah's body was in London, in the presidential suite, but her mind was already traveling through abstract dimensions of numbers, rehearsing strategies for the war of the next day. The clash of two worlds was over. Now there was only one world, the world of the exam. And Leah was about to find out whether raw talent from the outskirts would be enough to dismantle the most rigorously trained minds on the planet in the competition that would define the rest of her life. The grand hall of the competition felt like a Gothic cathedral devoted to silence and intellect, with its high ceiling and stained-glass windows filtering London's grey light, creating a solemn, intimidating atmosphere. Leah entered the arena with her heart racing, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the event and the quiet arrogance of her opponents. Around her were young prodigies from Swiss preparatory schools, geniuses trained in elite academies in China, and heirs of academic dynasties from the United States. They wore uniforms with crests, carried brand-name pens, and chatted in closed circles, radiating the blind confidence of those programmed from the cradle for that moment. Leah, in her simple hoodie and the fountain pen Renato had given her, looked like an intruder in a private club, a dissonant note in a symphony of elitist perfection. Imposter syndrome hit her at full force, whispering that she had walked into the wrong party and that the exit door was the only logical direction. When the proctors handed out the exams, the sound of paper being flipped echoed like the beating of thousands of wings, a dry noise that marked the beginning of the mental war. Leah looked at the first page and felt a chill run through her spine that had nothing to do with the English weather. The questions were not just difficult, they were monstrous logical constructions designed to break the candidate's spirits. They were problems that blended abstract algebra, topology, and number theory into statements that read like indecipherable riddles written in a foreign language. For a moment, panic locked her brain. The formulas she had memorized evaporated, and the weight of responsibility felt crushing. She thought of the raffle money, of Renato's hopeful face, of baby Kevin, and felt she was about to disappoint everyone with a humiliating public failure. The first 30 minutes were pure agony and paralysis. While around her the frantic scratching of pens against paper showed that the other competitors were already attacking the problems, Leah kept staring at the blank page, her mind spinning in place. She tried to apply the traditional academic methods she had seen in borrowed books, but they felt clumsy and insufficient for the complexity of the questions. She felt like someone trying to knock down a concrete wall with a plastic spoon. The rigidity of the academic environment suffocated her. She was used to studying with noise, with life, with the urgency of survival, and that sterile laboratory silence was killing her creativity. She was playing their game by their rules and she was losing badly. Then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, remembering what it felt like to hold Kevin on the plane. She remembered how she had ignored the social instruction manual and trusted her intuition, her rhythm, her inner music. Mathematics is the language of nature, she repeated to herself, the mantra her grandmother used to explain the world. Leah decided to stop trying to be a Harvard academic and started being herself, a brilliant intellectual improviser. She opened her eyes and looked at question 4, a spatial geometry problem that seemed impossible. Where others saw cold vectors and Cartesian planes, she saw the structure of her own roof, the wooden beams her uncle assembled, the distribution of weight that kept everything from collapsing. She translated the abstract into the real, the tactile, the world she knew and mastered. Leah's pen touched the paper and didn't stop. She began to draw not just numbers, but diagrams reflecting water flows, weaving patterns and musical rhythms. Where others relied on brute force design and memorization, Leah used elegance and efficiency, finding logical shortcuts that only someone used to doing a lot with very little could see. She dismantled the complexity of the problem with the same skill she used to take apart a broken appliance to fix it. Her mathematics wasn't clean and polished like in textbooks. It was organic, alive, pulsing. She was applying street science to the global elite, solving differential equations as if she were calculating the fastest route to escape the rain or the exact amount of ingredients needed to make a cake stretch further. A state of flow took over her completely, an absolute trance where time and space ceased to exist. Leah was no longer in London. She was inside the numbers, dancing with the variables, conducting an orchestra of symbols. She realized that the proposed problems, though wrapped in pompous academic language, dealt with fundamental issues of balance, proportion and change, things she lived every single day. The question about optimizing limited resources? That was her entire life. The question about probability in chaotic systems? That was her daily routine in the outskirts. She had an advantage none of those rich kids had. She lived the mathematics of scarcity, and that gave her X-ray vision to find solutions where others only saw problems. As the proctors walked the aisles, one of them stopped behind Leah's chair, drawn by the strangeness of her scratch work. He frowned, confused, seeing graphs that blended knot theory with patterns resembling braided hair. At first he thought she was scribbling in desperation, but as he looked closer, his eyes widened. He saw that the girl wasn't following the standard path. She was creating a new route, an original theorem improvised right there in the heat of the moment. Her solution was bold, heterodox, almost defiant of classical rules, but the logic was impeccable, solid as rock. The proctor moved on, shaken, knowing he had just witnessed something rare, the birth of an original idea in real time. As the exam moved into its final hours, mental exhaustion began to take down competitors around her. Leah saw the boy at the next desk, a gold medal favorite, drop his pen and bury his head in his hands, defeated by question 6, the infamous skull crusher. Leah read the statement, a problem about wave frequencies and destructive interference. She lit up inside. That wasn't just physics, that was Kevin's crying on the plane. She remembered the vibration she created in her throat to cancel out external noise. She used that sensory memory to model the science, applying harmonic theory in a way no textbook ever taught. While the trained genius struggled, the intuitive girl flowed, turning life experience into top marks. When the final bell rang, echoing through the hall like a closing gong, Leah dropped her pen, flexing her numb fingers and aching arm. She looked at the pages filled with her hurried handwriting and strange drawings, feeling an exhaustion that reached her soul, mixed with a quiet euphoria. She didn't know if she had gotten everything right, didn't know if the judges would understand her unconventional methods, but she knew she had given everything she had. She had translated her reality, her pain, her struggle, and her hope into mathematical language. She hadn't tried to imitate an elite, she had forced mathematics to speak her language. Staggering slightly as she left the hall, dizzy from the intellectual effort, Leah found Renato waiting for her in the corridor, with the same anxiety of a father waiting outside an operating room. He didn't ask, "How did it go?" He simply looked at her face, searching for signs of defeat or victory. Leah, with deep dark circles under her eyes but a fierce gleam in them, offered only a tired, enigmatic smile. She said nothing, but her posture had changed. She no longer walked hunched over, apologizing for taking up space. She walked with the certainty of someone who had slain the most terrifying monsters of logic and lived to tell the tale, without knowing that the true validation of her effort would come in a way that would shock the academic world days later. The award ceremony took place in an auditorium even more sumptuous than the competition venue, an old theater lined with red velvet and gold leaf details, where the world's academic elite gathers to crown its new kings and queens. Leah was seated at the end of the row, squeezed between a Japanese and a German competitor, feeling small inside her simple dress that Renato had insisted on buying for the occasion. The air was charged with a static electricity of anxiety, with hundreds of hearts beating in the accelerated rhythm of anticipation. The names of the bronze and silver medal winners were called, an endless list of prestigious surnames and renowned schools, each announcement followed by polite applause and practiced smiles. Leah clapped mechanically, her hands cold with sweat, her mind already rehearsing a consoling speech to herself, convinced that her wild, unconventional approach to the test had been dismissed by conservative judges as a crude mistake or a worthless mathematical aberration. However, when it came time to announce the absolute gold, the medal awarded for a perfect score and the most innovative solution, the head of the examination committee made a dramatic pause that silenced the theater. He adjusted his glasses and spoke into the microphone with a tone of evident perplexity, saying that year the committee had encountered something unprecedented. a paper that not only arrived at the correct results but reinvented the path to reach them. He described the solutions as logical poetry and raw art, mentioning the use of intuitive topologies that no computer had anticipated. Leah felt her blood run cold, recognizing the description of her own organized chaos. When her name, Leah da Silva from Brazil, echoed through the speakers, the sound seemed to come from an infinite distance, traveling through a tunnel of disbelief before reaching her consciousness and leaving her frozen in her seat. The silence that followed the announcement lasted only a second, but it was the longest second of Leah's life. It was the time needed for reality to collide with her self-image as an imposter. She did not move immediately. She needed Renato, seated in the row behind her as a VIP guest, to touch her shoulder and whisper an emotional, "Go, champion," for her legs to respond to her brain. Standing up from that chair felt like breaking free from the gravity of her past. As she walked toward the stage, under blinding spotlights that turned her into the center of the universe, Leah felt she was not walking alone. Each step was taken alongside her grandmother, the raffle neighbor, the baker, with every person who had invested a single reel of hope in her. She climbed the steps not as a student, but as a representative of a multitude of invisible people who, in that moment, were becoming giants. As the heavy metal was placed around her neck, the cold of the metal against her skin served as a jolt of definitive reality. The committee president shook her hand with a vigor that showed professional respect, looking her in the eyes as if facing a rare scientific discovery. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks, recording for modernity the face of the girl from the outskirts who had just humbled the logic of the most expensive preparatory courses in the world. Leah looked out at the audience and saw Renato standing, applauding with a ferocity that broke the protocol of British etiquette, tears flowing freely down the face of the Iron Man. His applause was worth more than that of the academics. It was recognition from someone who had seen the magic happen behind the scenes, who knew that metal had been forged in the fire of adversity, not in the comfort of academia. But the ceremony held a final surprise that would make the gold medal seem like mere appetizer. Before Leah left the stage, a representative from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the legendary MIT, took the floor, breaking the original script of the event. He announced that, due to the exceptional singularity of the judgment demonstrated in the exam, the university was offering Leah not just congratulations, but a full scholarship, covering tuition, housing, and personal expenses for the next 4 years. The auditorium erupted in a buzz of shock and admiration. This was not just a prize, it was a golden ticket to the future, a lifetime guarantee that she would never again need to sell raffle tickets to earn the right to think. The MIT scholarship was the master key that opened every door on the planet, the ultimate validation that her mind was a heritage of humanity. Leah felt her knees give way and had to lean on the podium to keep from falling. The news of the scholarship was the final blow to her composure. She cried right there in front of everyone, a cathartic cry that washed away years of anguish, fear of hunger, and uncertainty about tomorrow. It was not a cry of sadness, but the release of a tectonic pressure she had carried since birth. She thought of her mother, who worked double cleaning shifts to buy notebooks, and understood how that news would change her family's history forever. Poverty, which had always been her faithful shadow, was finally being dissipated by the incandescent light of her own talent. She had beaten the system by playing the hardest game of all, and the reward was total freedom to be who she was born to be. Walking down from the stage was a surreal experience, as if she were floating. Competitors who had not even looked at her before now extended their hands to congratulate her, wanting to touch the genius, to see if some of that talent might rub off by osmosis. Professors from European universities handed her business cards, offering innovations and mentorships. Leah, still dazed, clutched the medal tightly, as if it were a talisman protecting her from waking up from that dream. She found Renato in the crowd, and when their eyes met, there was a deep mutual understanding. He no longer saw her as the babysitter, nor as someone he was protecting. He saw her as an equal, perhaps even as a superior in terms of pure potential. The dynamic between them had shifted from assistance to mutual admiration and absolute respect. Renato hugged Leah when she reached him, an awkward but deeply paternal embrace. "You did it, girl. You folded the world in half," he said, laughing in disbelief. He knew he had made the best investment of his life with that credit card that paid for the hotel. Seeing Leah's victory gave him a satisfaction that no quarterly profit had ever provided. He felt he had taken part in something historic, that he had helped launch a rocket that now had no ceiling. Her joy was contagious, a pure energy that rejuvenated the weary spirit of the CEO. They celebrated right there in the middle of the lobby, two unlikely allies united by fate, laughing at the irony of how it had all begun with a baby's cry on an airplane. News of the victory spread across the world at digital speed. Leah had barely left the theater when her phone, an old model with a cracked screen, was already buzzing with thousands of notifications. The community in Brazil was celebrating. Videos of fireworks on her street, voice messages from neighbors shouting, messages of pride flooded her inbox. She realized that the medal was not hers, it was theirs. She was merely the physical bearer of a collective victory. The sense of duty fulfilled was overwhelming. She had honored every cent, every prayer, every gesture of support. She had not left anyone behind. On the contrary, she had just put the name of her neighborhood on the map of global excellence. Yet, as the euphoria began to settle and the reality of a new life at MIT started to take shape on the horizon, Leah and Renato found themselves in a moment of calm before the farewell. They were in the car, heading back to the hotel, the medal gleaming on her lap and baby Kevin sleeping in the car seat beside her. It was in that instant of reflective silence that both realized the true lesson of that journey was not in mathematics, nor in business contracts, nor in the scholarship. There was something more, a fundamental truth submerged throughout the adventure that now, at the end of the road, was about to emerge as the definitive legacy of that singular encounter. The return to the hotel was marked by a silence very different from the one that had filled the car upon arriving in London. It was not the silence of fear or discomfort, but a reverent quiet, the kind that arises after witnessing something sacred. Renato looked out the window, watching the city lights pass by, and his mind rewound the film of the last 48 hours, trying to pinpoint the exact moment his life had changed. He looked at Leah, who was dozing off in exhaustion, clutching the gold medal in her hand as if it were a rough diamond, and realized that her mathematics had not only solved the competition, it had solved him. The arrogance he had worn like a second skin had been dissolved not by force, but by the extreme gentleness of innocence. He understood, with piercing clarity, that if Leah had not stood up from her economy-class seat, he would have lost far more than his patience. He would have lost the chance to reconnect with his own humanity. The realization hit the billionaire hard. Everything that had happened, the saved contract, the gold medal, the MIT scholarship, Kevin's peace, had grown from a single seed planted in the barren soil of panic at 35,000 feet. That simple gesture from Leah, crossing the forbidden curtain and offering help when everyone else offered judgment, was the big bang that created this new universe of possibilities for both of them. Renato grasped the overwhelming power of proactive compassion. It was not his money that saved the day, nor her intelligence alone. It was a warm decision to care about another person's pain. He, who had always traded futures and derivatives, discovered that the most valuable asset in the world is empathy, and that it yields returns no financial spreadsheet can calculate. The gratitude he felt was not for her being a good babysitter, but for being human when no one else was. Leah, briefly waking with the motion of the car, looked at Kevin in his car seat and felt a wave of love that could not fit into equations. She knew the medal around her neck was important, but the weight of the baby in her arms during the flight and the days that followed had taught her lessons MIT would never teach. She learned that her worth was not only in her ability to solve logical problems, but in her capacity to feel and relieve suffering. Academic victory validated her mind, but her connection with that family validated her heart. She saw that intelligence without purpose is mere vanity, and that her mathematical gift was, in truth, a tool to serve, to build bridges where there were once abysses. The trip to London was not about winning a prize, it was about discovering that she had the power to alter realities, whether with numbers or with affection. The concept of legacy was rewritten for both of them that night. Renato had always believed that legacy meant leaving buildings with his name on them and swollen bank accounts for his heirs. Now, looking at the young prodigy beside him, he saw that legacy is the impact you leave on people's lives. He had used his influence to level the playing field for Leah, and that action was worth more than any corporate merger he had ever brokered. He knew Leah would go to MIT and change the world, perhaps discovering new energy sources or curing diseases through data modeling, and he would have been the step that allowed that ascent. That feeling of being part of something greater, of being a facilitator of other people's dreams, filled an existential void he had never known existed. For Kevin, the baby who had unknowingly set everything in motion, the legacy would be invisible but eternal. He would grow up with no memory of the earache or the chaotic flight, but he would carry within him the energy of that encounter. He would be raised by a transformed father, a man who had learned to look at invisible people with respect and curiosity. Leah's lullaby, with its ancestral wisdom, had been etched into the child's subconscious, a magical protection against the coldness of the world he would live in. Leah's compassion had broken the cycle of emotional neglect that threatened the bond between father and son, stitching together a new family dynamic based on presence and genuine care. When the car finally stopped, the farewell did not carry the tone of a goodbye, but of a see you soon between battle partners. Renato no longer offered money or gifts, he offered something rarer, his friendship and lifelong mentorship. He looked Leah in the eyes and promised that wherever she was in the world, she would have an ally. "You saved my son, Leah. And I think you saved me too," he confessed, his voice breaking as he shed the last layer of pride. Leah smiled gently, that open smile that disarmed armies, and replied that he had saved her as well, by giving her the chance to show the world what she was capable of. It was a perfect tie of generosity, where no one took from the other, because both walked away with their souls full. The final image of that journey was not the shining medal, but their hands clasped in the hotel lobby before they went their separate ways. The calloused hand of the girl from the outskirts and the well-groomed hand of the billionaire, joined for a brief moment, symbolized the breaking of the barriers the world insists on erecting. They proved that solidarity is the only force capable of crossing social classes, races and prejudices. That handshake sealed a silent pact that humanity, when exercised with courage, is the most advanced technology there is. They knew they would never be the same. The experience had left deep marks, scars of light that would guide their choices from then on. As Leah walked to her room to pack for a new life in Boston, and Renato went up to the penthouse to truly be a father, one certainty hung in the air: that story would be told. Not as tabloid gossip, but as an urban legend, the story of the mathematical babysitter and the humbled CEO who found redemption at 35,000 feet. The seed planted on the airplane had grown into a forest. And the most astonishing thing was to realize that everything, absolutely everything, the glory, the success, the transformation, began because a teenager decided not to put on her headphones and ignore a child's cry. True power, they concluded, does not lie with those who command, but with those who stand up. Leah stood up. And by doing so, she lifted everyone around her. The world would keep turning with its injustices and inequalities, but in that small microcosm they had created, compassion had won by a landslide. And that victory, silent and personal, was the fuel both would use to face the enormous challenges the future, now bright and promising, held for them. The elevator doors closed, separating them physically, but their story continued to echo, opening an infinite loop of possibilities where compassion is always the investment with the greatest return. And so ends Renato and Leah's trip, but the true journey, the one that happens inside our minds, begins now. This story is a slap in the face of our reality, isn't it? It forces us to look in the mirror and ask, what truly defines the value of a human being? Renato had billions in his accounts, but in that moment of desperation he was the poorest man in the world. Leah didn't have a single cent in her pocket, yet she carried a wealth of wisdom and empathy that no amount of money can buy. Here is the reflection I want you to take with you to your pillow tonight. How many Elias are out there right now, invisible, riding crowded buses, selling raffle tickets, with brilliant minds that could cure diseases or change the world, but who never get a single chance simply because they were born in the wrong zip code? How many geniuses are we losing to inequality and prejudice? Mathematics is exact, but life demands far more than numbers. It demands the awareness to truly see another person. Now I want to hear from you, and be honest with me here in the comments. If you were in Leah's place back there in economy class, watching that wealthy father being humiliated, would you have had the courage to stand up, cross the curtain, and face the judgmental stares to help? Or would the fear of rejection have spoken louder? Right below, I would have gone, or I would have stayed. I really want to read your opinion. And if this story touched your heart in any way, if it made you rethink your values even for a second, then do this. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell right now. Here on Stories Nick, we bring stories that don't just entertain but transform. Don't miss the chance to be part of this community. Until the next video, remember, the real gold is sometimes found where we least expect it.